So welcome, Daniel. Welcome, Cadell. We're here to celebrate Daniel's course, which begins July 7th, Parallax, Belonging Again, an address with OG Rose. He'll be doing it with his lovely wife, Michelle, and I'm sure it's going to be as wonderfully explosive and full of ideas and congeniality as the last one. So maybe we'll just start off and with that. Maybe Daniel, you could just tell us a little bit about the course, and then we'll bring in Cadell for hopefully a deep and interesting conversation.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and Cadell, always a delight to speak with you. So it's really great to see you, and thank you again, Mr. Sweeney, for the opportunity to teach again at Parallax. Michelle and I had such a wonderful time in November with Ivan Illich, and ever since then, my love for Illich has ever just been deepening the more and more I go down that rabbit hole. So that invitation has been very inspiring, and continually thinking that work, because I think Mr. Illich is certainly central to thinking new institutions, new political economy, new education, new sustainability as people pursue, say, their creative drives. And I know Cadell has been speaking and framing a lot of our challenge today in terms of society, in terms of how do we sustain creativity, the creative procreation alongside biological procreation or creativity. And I would say that Belonging Again is absolutely interested in those kind of questions, which I think Ivan Illich was interested. So we can see the course as a continuation of those kind of concerns. A way to think about belonging, because we're certainly not talking about kind of a traditional, how do we go back nostalgic to belonging and being at home. But problematically, that is for most of history what belonging has been, meaning it could lead to the banality of evil, of a Hannah Arendt, closed-mindedness, a lack of development of subjectivity, tribalism in a kind of negative sense, et cetera, so forth. So if we're going to talk about belonging in a new way, according to a new address, we're going to have to not be falling into those ditches. And if we don't fall, if we don't figure out, if we don't address the problem of belonging, then I think it's only a matter of time before people get psyoped or sucked into political projects, old institutions that are going to lead to all sorts of economic, geopolitical, and political turmoil, or just lead to a slow, gradual withering away of the human subject as it gives up on creative possibility or biological possibility. And I would say that's a continuation of the Ivan Illich project. The course is going to be going through section by section of Belonging Again 2, the address 2.1, which is continuing from Belonging Again, an explanation. So the first book was an explanation of the situation today, because I think if you don't properly explain the situation today, you might go forth on what you think is going to address what we need to do, or maybe put a lot of time into a project that will ultimately prove fragile or collapse or not really work out, right? So an explanation is necessary. Now, a playlist for people interested in the course, you don't need to go and necessarily read all of Belonging Again 1 to be ready for Belonging Again 2 at all. There's a playlist on YouTube that gets things up to speed. I actually had a conversation with Cadell about Belonging Again 1 that could be found on his channel, as well as about Belonging Again 2.1 that could help kind of frame the conversation. And a way to kind of sum up part one before handing it back off is we live in a day, to put it very simply, following a lot of the sociologists like Peter Berger, Philip Reeve, Freud, Civilization's Discontents. We're going to be talking, James Hunter, etc. We're going to be talking about today how we have no givens, no background by which to sustain our subjectivity. So a way to put this is in the past, if you grew up and you were born Hindu, Hinduism wouldn't be an option for how to live. It would be the isness of reality. And sure, you'd know about other religions, you'd know about difference and pluralism, but it would all be situated within a givenness of that framework by which you understood things, right? Same goes with Christianity, secular, et cetera, right? Capital, it doesn't matter. Today, what defines the world is an awareness that our given background could have been different, or that it is arbitrary, or that it is not necessarily authoritative. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was false or entirely false. But even if it's somewhat true, but maybe false in other ways, we have to think about it. And then we have to figure out how to relate our beliefs with other people who may disagree, and we may never, and you start going into all that anxiety and uncertainty, right? Mr. Pierce in American Pragmatism talked about in the Ethics of Belief how one of the key functions of belief is actually to scratch an existential itch. We don't actually like thinking very much as human beings. What we like is thoughtlessness, to just kind of, we like knowing without thinking, you could say, a kind of unearned knowing that is more absorbed than it is earned, right? And that's how we function. And basically, today we could say we're in a world where no one can easily scratch their existential itch with beliefs. We have to think about what we believe. And in that condition, we're very prone to political extremism, very prone to break, all sorts of pathological, sociological responses that I think define the world today. Well, how are we going to address that? What would it look like to address this problem as opposed to ignore it or simply tell everyone to engage in their own individualistic projects by which they can, come to terms with reality? Well, there could be some legitimacy to that. But the problem is that that's not necessarily going to deal with the broader political economy or economic structure. That is an operation that is increasingly going to become pathological in different ways. So we can look at belonging as kind of really a claim of belonging again, too, is that we actually have never really done sociology, as funny as that might sound. Sociology emerged in the beginning of the 19th century as a result of globalization and global networks and global trade, of the realization that global pluralism was real. And that resulted in having to go, wow, I need to encounter difference. But what we actually did around the 19th century, and this is to sum up a long story going into people like Randall Collins and different things, is that instead of dealing with the tensions of sociology, which I actually would argue are the primary tensions of philosophy today, because it's about these kind of political economy, political economic structure, what we instead did is let the logic of economics do our thinking for us. Okay, rather than encounter difference, we'll create an economic logic by which we can interact with one another according to capital, dollars, exchange, and so on and so forth. And that you could argue that worked. That worked for quite a little bit. But the problem is, if Tyler Cohn is right about the great stagnation, if economics is now based on an increase of asset value in a Piketty structure, if the middle class is eroding away, then that reliance on economics to do our pluralism for us is no longer sustainable. And so that means we have to take it on more directly.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, because there's a lot there and maybe we want to flesh some of it out. So I think it's quite clear that the problem that you're talking about is, again, this tension or dialectic between traditions, which no longer, appeal to people, and let's say moving into the future with, our own idiosyncratic communities and views and so in terms of belonging, what do we belong to? Okay. And then you mentioned something about the fact that this is a sociological question. It's a community question. It's often been, this has been hijacked by the economics. So I wonder if I could pull Cadell in and see how you feel in that whole, let's say, I'm using the word that gets used a lot in your world because of your Hegelian studies, this dialectic between, let's say, tradition and ideas and novelty and progress and moving forward into the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing here is that with the loss of traditional life, there has been a loss of ontological commitment. In traditional life, and now this is not a bad thing, I think. This is a negativity, but not a bad thing. I think the loss of givens is a tremendous opportunity. If we are willing to confront that in the loss of givens, in the loss of a traditional background, what we really find in contemporary society is a mass that is largely living out a life of simple pleasures. And so what I take to be the meaning and the direction of Daniel's work. And if I was to be brutally violent and rename his work, it would be something like "The hard road is the only road left." And so the hard road is really not giving in to a type of reactionary return to traditional backgrounds, and also not falling into a life of simple pleasures, but really taking on the burden and the responsibility of a deep ontological commitment. That's the hard road. The real transformation philosophically in our thinking about this, though, and what's entailing a hard road and ontological commitment, is that there's a way in which your subjectivity, your creative energy, is itself involved in ontological questions. When we think about the O.G. Rose project, when we think about the Parallax project, when we think about the Philosophy Portal project, these are hard roads. These are roads that by definition involve failure. These are roads that by definition involve confronting difficult questions about political economy. These projects are themselves not just epistemologies, but literal new realities that people can engage with, even if, you know, they didn't exist 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. The point is that, again, if we were to break up Daniel's book by my reading, we have on the one hand this hard road where there's no easy ideologies to solve the problem. On the level of universality, we have what's framed as the meta crisis. Let's say that's what is commonly referred to as universal. We have a meta crisis. Daniel's saying basically, there's no easy ideologies here. There's no given ontologies here. There's no simplistic teleologies here. There's no deconstructive voids, not the answer. We're forced to confront ourselves. We're forced to confront ourselves, and we're forced to confront, again, the risk of falling into simple pleasures and the challenge of committing to an ontological project. But then there's another move in Daniel's work by my reading, is that project has to confront universality. And that meaning that we cannot just continue saying meta crisis, meta crisis, meta crisis. Our projects have to be the very solution, not in referencing the meta crisis, but just on being a new reality, which is itself the solution. And so that means our projects have to be stress tested by the universal. And what I mean by stress testing the universal is that and this is the big trap of a lot of people, I think, from my analysis, my diagnosis of various projects in these circles, is that they cannot get trapped in a particularist loop. That's the big risk, is that we get trapped and isolated in particularist communities which actually don't really engage true problems of universality. And so the question I think we all have to ask ourselves is, you know, are our ideas, are our projects actually impinging on universality? Are they actually engaging universal negativities? And I think that's the challenge before us. And I'll just close up very quickly, but I think the culture war today has undergone a transformation of a fundamental nature in the last 5 to 10 years. And I would say that culture war can be described in these oppositional battles between 10 years ago. The very dividing line was blue pill, red pill. And what blue pill, red pill stood for was woke progressives versus evolutionary reality, largely speaking. Now the culture war has shifted, and this has happened in the last 5 years, but there's a new dividing line. And I would say that dividing line is between doomer pill and Christ pill. And doomer pill and Christ pill is now, I think, where the real tension line is. However, and this is my closing point.
Doomer pill and Christ pill, is that what you said?
Yes.
Oh, I
So
see.
like
Okay, the return to
a
Christianity.
type of
Got it.
nihilistic,
Mhm.
emptiness versus a
Mhm.
type of Christ-centric in my view, a type of Christ-centric regressivity. This idea that
Mhm.
Christ-centric communities, very particularist, will resolve the meta crisis, the universal crisis. I
Mhm.
think that, and this is my final point, is that I think both these culture war tension points, blue pill, red pill, doomer pill, Christ pill, they're both symptoms of political economy. And so this is where Daniel and I's work are aligned. Because
Mhm.
basically, I see that political economy on the level of universality is really where the true crisis and where these culture wars are merely symptoms of this. There's a crisis of property, there's a crisis of social contract, and there's an emergence of unrightable wrongs. And so, unless we solve the crisis of property, unless we solve the crisis of social contract, unless we address those dimensions concretely, then we have a civilization which is not able to reproduce itself. We have a civilization that's not able to substantiate itself in any meaningful sense. And well, this is where we get the breakdown of all sorts of individualisms and geopolitical crises, which is very much alive in the analysis of Ojiro's work. So I'll just end with that.
Mhm. Yeah, there's so much there. I'm interested in your thoughts about property and what you mean by that. And also again, I think I've been feeling recently that the culture war in itself is quite sterile. It's not the place where things are happening. It's just two big egregores, attacking each other, and that one has to go beneath it or beyond it or find another place to react. But then perhaps I wonder about the universals that you're speaking of. So and what that means, what that means to be, held responsible to the universals. I don't know if that's exactly what you said, but so anyway, I'll pass it on to Daniel.
No, that was marvelous, and everything Cadell said, I agree with. I think that's perfectly put. Basically, um, when it comes to a universal, the only universal we have found that to some degree works regarding the problem of global pluralism, and it is a problem because it is the problem of encountering difference and being able to handle it. And most people, when they encounter difference, reflect on themselves, and then they have kind of existentially break down. And in that place of existential breakdown, they are susceptible to strongmen. It is not by chance you have an explosion of popularism, because in a way, what popularism is trying to create a populace spreading a certain ideological consistency in which you can feel belonging. And that's the problem. That's the kind of belonging we're trying to fight. Like, one of the issues that the book tries to claim is it basically is not an option to not have belonging at all. Because if you say, especially once you get to political economy, because you have to work with people, and if you feel like, man, we all belong together because we can't find a home, like we're kind of more nomadic or nowhere, well, there's a kind of belonging in that. If there's a belonging that you find like, oh, I'm being sustained by the economy in my projects and in my work and in my family, there's a belonging in that because I'm economically sustained. The problem is a belonging, as Cadell was talking about, that has this kind of ideological consistency that actually removes the subject for the universal. It moves you from the particular to, you could say, the mass or the mob, or two categories that are described in belonging, again, one. And either mass or mob, mass being this kind of thoughtless banality of evil, mob being the kind of revenge-seeking, tear it all down and let's see if something comes up. And both of those are the temptations by which people fall into relative to politics today. But if you say, well, this was kind of the bet of neoliberalism and capitalism, and that this is proven to be, like Francis Fukuyama talk about, this is how we responded to pluralism as the problems of pluralism arose in the 18th century, which was economics and an economic totality, and ultimately a capital nation state, as Karatani talks about, because that's going to link everyone together. But it arguably, at the same time, made enough room for national differences. Yeah, America and Europe and China and Africa, they may trade with one another, but you can still defend your cultural difference within that economic exchange. Now, it turns out, though, that economics, through the value form, as Marx talks about, does, in fact, infringe upon particular difference because it does your valuing for you. everything becomes the dollar. And then, of course, there's corporate uses of other countries, governments get corrupt, and so on and so forth. And so we're at the phase now where you have to acknowledge that capitalism, as an effective means of dealing with the problem of difference, does so not through actually us coming to terms with diversity, but flattening difference to make it all what Marx says is kind of fetish, a fungible. It all becomes exchangeable. But that, of course, is flattening, and the reductionism that everyone is talking about is very problematic. Well, guess what? If you don't want that, but you want to have people able to handle diversity without reacting to it by going into one of these ideologically consistent bubbles that you could say, that means people are going to have a different way of valuing or value form or notion of what it is to formulate well as a human being that is not done for them by the economic system. And that would, for example, you would need a society that saw value in facing negativity for negativity's sake with no guarantees. That there was actually a value in encountering negativity and dealing with difficulty. Right now, people would say, that's kind of stupid. Why would you do that unless you're getting paid for it? Like you could say, the economy is all for negativity that gets you a wage. Okay, you're dealing with difficult people. Okay, you're taking on tough problems. Okay, you're emotionally stressed. But are you getting paid for it? Yes. Okay, well, that's acceptable. So the market created a way for people to face negativity, but it was framed. It was pre-framed within wage labor, right? Well, if we go back to Ivan Illich, wage labor requires all of the shadow work, all of the activities outside of the value form of the commodity by which to even be possible. And it is outside the market, it turns out, that the work of the subject to be able to handle difference is mostly done. Because at work, you can't talk about your beliefs. The boss will fire you. You don't have time to get into all of those different things or to confront yourself as a subject or your personal life. In fact, that's not what that space is for, right? So to bring in the personal tends to always be outside. And basically, the people you tend to navigate with outside of work tend to be people more like you, say in your church community or your bowling club, like people that have some sort of self-similarity. So the closing point is this. In order to actually start talking about a world that is able to take on global pluralism in a different way and politically think it through in terms of new contract, new property, new education, it would have to see value in dealing with and facing that negativity versus running from it. But just to kind of sum it up, right now, we're basically like, that's irrational unless you're getting paid for it. Unless you're getting paid to do it, unless you're being acknowledged by the economy, unless it's helping your career, there's no reason to do it. But that means you would have to have a society that sees value in the non-rational choice to not just follow what everyone thinks is practical or utilitarian or whatever, and actually face that negativity and formulate in light of that. But that is a matter of a different value form, a different notion of things that we should value. And then the question is the following. How do you create the infrastructure to incubate in people the notion that that is a valuable thing to do? Because if I just here's always the $1 million problem. If I just tell you, hey, it's good to do hard things. The problem is most people hear that and probably think they do hard things. Nobody tends to think that they run from pluralism. Nobody thinks that they try to avoid diversity. So speaking is the difference between information and formulation that, Smith will talk about. I like that. Where it's like, if we're trying to create new values on the level of information, telling people to value things outside of capitalism or whatever, everybody thinks they do that. And yet that's why capital is so effective, is it works on this realm of kind of self-deception or self-operation where you don't question yourself. So this gets into what is the infrastructure to incubate a different formulation of the subject, where they get into the habits and the notions of just facing negativity, because that's just what you do as a human being. That's just what you do as a human being. So those are some thoughts. I pass it on.
Now, I was thinking about Alex Ebert's recent article on Substack about how people publish a lot of stuff on Substack with the illusion that this is going to, be a form of income for them. And yes, it's such a small form of income, and they're hijacked by their audience often, right? And I've had that experience. I know when I had a popular blog on Medium, I knew that if I wrote about a certain type of subject, I would get a lot of views. But then I got very tired of doing that. So I wrote about subjects which were less, let's say, popular, which wouldn't get me the kind of views. And of course, the amount of money that comes in from these kind of things is not sustainable in terms of an income. So I wonder if the hard way that the Cadell's talking about, and we also named our course in Gurdjieff the hard way, is that you have to go against the tendency of easy applause or easy being appreciated by people, and do something that is a little bit stranger and more out there and more idiosyncratic and more closer to like this requires a bit of solitude. It requires pushing against the grain. It requires not having to always give feedback, et cetera, et cetera. It seems very difficult in the internet age. So belonging again for me would be belonging to one's own unique expression, which is not always always reliant on external feedback. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Oh, no, I would jump in and say, no, there's a lot to that. I mean, the problem of pluralism is creating another way, and then I'll give it to Cadell. Belonging again we'll talk about the triplex of belonging, which we can think of generally in terms of to have belonging, you need to feel cared for. You need to feel sustainable, like what you're doing is sustainable. And you have to feel like you can become whoever you're becoming or engage in your creative pursuits. So care, sustainability, and becoming. Here's the problem. If you start to become the kind of particular subjectivity that you're engaging in, the people that care about you can be worried about you. You can lose care. If you pursue something you care about, you could be isolated from the rest of society in that project. If you have economic sustainability, though, you tend to get that precisely because you abandon your passions and do the economic thing. And then, of course, if you have becoming and you're becoming your own individual, that runs the risk of becoming socially unintelligible to everyone else around you because they can't understand the thing that you're becoming. So you need all three of those, and yet all three of those exist in a frickin' tension trying to eat one another. And unless you get all three of those, you can't talk about economic sustainability. So there's this idea, like you're saying, on like pursuing your own project or having a kind of like creative expression. Pluralism requires a space for people to do that without sacrificing the social intelligibility or sustainability for people to do that. And then people in that difference that is a result of their own creative project have the subjectivity and ability to handle encountering people who choose different ontological commitments and unfoldings accordingly. Because that's the tough thing. When you, let's say, everyone knows like you do poetry. Okay, you do poetry and nobody pays you for it. And you're at the cocktail party and somebody asks, what do you do? I work, I do something. You don't talk about the poetry because you know how weird it is. It's embarrassing. It's weird, right? But if you can say, oh yeah, man, I work at Microsoft. Oh, wow, you're really making something of your life because there's a social script, right? What would it look like to have a society where people could literally talk about their ontological commitments and actually get recognition and acknowledgement, even if it is not a paid corporate career or different things like that? That's a very different society. But then hopefully, and then I'll give it to Cadell, belonging again, part 2 actually makes the argument that the inability to do that is not merely a matter of a nicety, or wouldn't it be great if we could handle it? No, it's economically sustainable because capitalism destroys demand, loses the dialectic between creativity and energy, and actually falls into stagnation unless you have a society to do that. Now, I just said a lot, but I just wanted to note in all of this that actually the argument is not merely a kind of wouldn't it be nice if, but it's actually economically necessary, because I would argue capital ultimately eats itself unless you have a society that can create demand, not merely stimulate demand, and that requires an incubation of creative drive. So capitalism, in habituating people out of creative drive for all the right reasons, ends up eating itself. So there's also a practical dimension to this in addition to everything else we were describing. But please, Cadell.
Well, I just want to state up front about the article that Sweeney's referencing by Alex Ebert that I'm not going to name names, but I've been on Substack since 2000, and very recently Substack has become hot, and I do see a lot of absurd characters now who are pandering to identity communities, who are explicitly generating content which is degrading the medium in service of cheap capitalist gains very quickly. And basically, it involves becoming some sort of charismatic maniac on polarizing topics. It's deeply symptomatic. It's symptomatic of people, one, not really thinking about business, but also not really aware of how difficult it is to build a business without becoming some sort of charismatic maniac or without doing some degrading form of very superficial exploitative maneuvers that are just designed to make a quick buck very quickly. And it comes down to the quite brutal and even twisted evil issue of what it means to embody the love for our weird projects while also building them up to some sort of sustainability. It's super difficult. It's the $1,000,000,000,000,000 question, and it is totally related to the incubation of the creative drive, which is why the philosophy that I gravitate towards, the philosophy that I've orbited now for almost a decade, is totally drive-centric. It's the central signifier. And at the same time, this problem of the creative drive, if it is to be taken seriously on the level of universality, has to take seriously the problem of capitalism, because capitalism is our universality. God did not die. God was transformed into capital, as Giorgio Agamben says, which is a line I think is absolutely correct. And this is visible. The problem of capitalism in regards to contemporary political tensions on a geopolitical level is absolutely visible in the recent EU elections, the way the recent EU elections went, contemporary China, American representative democracy. That's what I mean when I speak about universality, is your project actually engaging universality, or is it some sort of weird particularist isolated symptom of this universality? And this is not being approached on either the left or the right with any significant political theory. Politics and political science has been reduced to a data. It's now about data. It's not about theory, which is why I'm also trying to teach the philosophy of right, not only because there's a certain tradition in Hegelianism that I'm trying to work through at Philosophy Portal, but also because it's allowing for a certain structuring moment as it regards to political universality. The left totally forecloses and represses issues of capitalism. The right, you could argue, fetishizes and identifies with capitalism. And so the question that I think we have to come back to is, can capitalism be sublated? And if so, how to do it? And by sublated, I do not mean abolished. By sublated, I mean put in its right place. And by put in its right place, meaning that it has many positive benefits. And this is something that Daniel's really great at bringing out. One of the great strengths of Daniel's work, if I'm to sort of big up the book and the course, is that Daniel does a fantastic job of weaving through themes of sociology and capitalism in a way that's not reductive, in a way that's not simplifying, in a way that's bringing you and confronting you with the key tensions in the field. And it takes a remarkable skill to be able to do that. So it's one of the things that I appreciate the most in Daniel's work. And it is an aim at universality. Daniel's work is not regressing into particularity. He is engaging with figures like Dugan, figures like Nick Land, figures like just the leading thinkers in economics and politics. Daniel's engaging with them. So this is not a particularist regressive move. Now, as it regards to the philosophical work that I try to focus on at Philosophy Portal, there's a interesting relationship between Marx and Hegel that I think we need to get right, which is related to this dialectic which Marx develops between feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and communism. Now, in Marxist influence politics, there is a tendency of leftists to not think, but rather just engage in a type of revolutionary upsurge. This idea that they can just have a revolution and overthrow the capitalist order for some sort of socialist communist project. And this is precisely, I think, where I think of Daniel's idea that everyone likes to think that they're doing a hard thing. That's not a hard thing. That's simple. That's actually not thinking. So this is also why in Zizek's philosophy, he's always against the revolutionary upsurge by asking, what about the day after? He's asking for revolutionary politics to think about, are the buses going to run on time? How does the education system work? What about the food distribution systems? These are the really hard questions that no one wants to think about those things, because those are not sexy things to think about. No one's going to give you a lot of attention for thinking about, Daniel always says, how do I get the hammer at the local hardware store? These are not sexy questions. These are not things that anyone likes to think about, but it's those day-to-day things that are the nature of our political order. It's simply about, do you have a functioning society on the level of property and contracts and rights and wrongs? These are just very basic things. Then the final thing I'll say, and this is connected to, I think, the major thing about education today is how should we really confront this question, to me, very open question about capitalism to socialism, because I'm not here an identitarian in any way. I don't identify with any revolutionary project. Is how do we really move from capitalism to something like the commons? This is something I've been working through with Joris de Kelver, who's one of my closest collaborators, who actually works in a commons. And my firsthand information from him is it involves handling, holding, transforming enormous amounts of subjective negativity in regards to just very basic things of day-to-day life and how we live as a people with other people. It involves dealing with real negative affects. And to me, this is why, if we are to define, I just recently had Greg Dember into the portal to talk about metamodernism. Greg Dember talks about metamodernism as the defense of historical subjectivity of a space of affects, and to take affects seriously in relationship to reductionist science or postmodern relativity, whatever. The key thing, and this is to me the negative moment of metamodernism, meaning the moment where, for me, I don't identify as a metamodernist, is we have to hold a space of affects, but we at the same time have to negativize those affects, because those affects are not truth. Those affects need to be held, but they also need to be negativized. And so those affects are only useful insofar as they're pointing towards something, but they're not in themselves truth. And so this is what education is today. And when I say education, I mean on the level of logic, on the level of the concept. Education today is, how do we both build containers for affects and negativize those affects in the direction that points towards genuine freedom, genuine liberation on the level of political economy. So
just a couple of things before I pass it to, if you don't mind. Yeah. So I thought all that was great. And I also wanted to express my appreciation for Daniel's book. It occurred to me as I was reading it that what you're doing is very different in terms of a book that I've read, and that is that you're in conversation not only with Hegel and Nietzsche and Ivan Illich and all the great thinkers. You're in conversation with your contemporaries. So I noticed that Cadell's names came up very often in the book, and Alex E. Bird, and even myself once or twice. That this is a conversation with a large field rather than a singular let's say somebody's kind of book that's trying to develop a singular theory. So anyway, I thought there's something wonderful about your way of just being able to, let's say, have such a wide wide field of exploration. Yeah, there was a few other things that Cadell addressed in terms of, it seems to me that what is necessary if you're going to have a poet or a philosopher or any of these occupations which are not very, practical in the immediate, is that something has to be done about the economics, the money of it, the whole thing. So somebody was telling me that a lot of people talk about tantric sex, but very few people talk about tantric money, because money is the energy that is flowing and creating things. So in my sense, the anti-capitalist movement sort of forecloses that and has a sense of trying to control everything, whereas a hyper-capitalist thing would just be out of control. Where's the sweet spot, and how do we work with, just saying it directly, work with money, because you said these communities also need money, and anyway, that's something I've been thinking about recently, and I wanted to bring up.
Well, that was all magnificent. First off, thank you for your kind words, Sweeney, and thank you for your kind words as well, Cadell. I really appreciate you noting that, Mr. Sweeney. Hegel would emphasize that we need to think the now. Since all of you fine people are part of the now, then we need to thank you. But also, Zizek, I think, is correct when he says we need to interpret, so we need to bring the old into the new, and there's a sublation there. I think one of the things that can hurt thought is just wanting to specialize in a classical thinker, which, I'm all about reading old books. I think one of the great problems is that we don't read old books because we're smarter than them, which is easy to think if you don't read those books, because, you don't realize that you're not smarter than them. It's always convenient to believe something that's counter you never let yourself encounter. And so we need to bring all of those things together. But then also, I think there is a danger now of overly demonizing the specialist, but there is also a danger in overly demonizing the generalist. And I think basically this problem of belonging, again, is very interdisciplinary, where it has to be economics and sociology and Hegel and philosophers and all of these different people, and the people who are thinking the discussion in the now, we have to tarry with the negative of the now, that if we don't do that, we're basically just going to end up in particularist projects, as Cadell was saying. I think that's how it goes. And again, I do want to defend the specialists in the sense that I was reading, because I've been thinking a lot on the relation of aesthetics and formulation. And I was reading a lot on books about the image of childhood in medieval art, and going through like 4 different thinkers to show the conception of the image, to show a developing subjectivity. And if there were not specialists who didn't dedicate a whole lot of time on understanding medieval art, or the history of the notion of witchcraft in South Africa, or the civilizing effect of some of the sociologists, the thinking that could be done now to help us deal with this problem of formulation, you would not have resources to think. So it's important to honor the specialists, but then we also have to bring them into something that's, I think, interdisciplinary to think this severe problem of belonging again. So I appreciate you noticing that. A few things come to mind. On this first, Denver rocks, Yorgis rocks. Both of them are wonderful. And on that idea of the FXs, I think that gets into where Ebert stresses the encounter, the surprise, the limitation. You need to have the oscillation of the metamodern drive you into encountering something, bringing you to a place of surprise. And that encounter is negativity. I was reading on this point, Matthew Stanley's incredible book on ideology and Christian freedom, which is an analysis of Endo Silence, that novel, the Japanese Christian, and that kind of idea. And what was so brilliant that Mr. Stanley was bringing up is the book kind of ends on the idea of Father Rodriguez, I believe, kind of stepping on the picture of Jesus, that publicly says he doesn't believe in Christianity more, but he's like, but that's okay because I still have this kind of private faith. So even if I'm socially not acknowledged, it's okay. And what Stanley was so brilliantly pointing out is that mistake is kind of like where Zizek will talk about Buddhism as an ego death, where then you have this kind of ego death. So both of those are mistakes in terms of political economy, meaning you go into an isolated belief that you know and you don't need anyone to see it, or you just kind of ego death and you don't have to worry about the ego at all. Both of those result in a particularization through a kind of what I was calling inward ranging. right? Where you move inward. Any political, now, of course, there are many different forms of Buddhism. There are many forms of Christianity. There are many forms of every religion. So I'm not trying to generalize about everything. But the key move that Zizek is putting his finger on, that Matthew Stanley is bringing up in the context of silence, in this moving inward and disregarding the outward, if you will. In that context, and metamodernism could do that if it's focused just on the oscillation. But the difference then is bringing yourself in that place of the oscillation, of the affect, to forcing yourself to encounter the other, the negativity. That is the move that every single particularist project, if you will, must do, or it will ignore the universal. But that move right there is freaking hard. Because what if it costs you your audience? What if everyone in Substack no longer wants to read you? What if you betray Christianity? What if you, you're a communist. Oh, you hate capitalism, you like capitalism. The moment you talk about encountering the other, facing the negativity and not strawmanning them, like really, really trying to meet them, you run the risk of your audience. You run the risk of your platform. You run the risk of alienating your community. Well, that means in order to actually make people sustainable in that encounter, you have to have an economic system and an infrastructure that does not penalize people for moving beyond the internal space into the encounter with the other. Like, you are basically penalized now by the system for being a true pluralist. We can talk all day long how we love difference and diversity and pluralism and all that. We do not. We do not at all. Only in so much as you acknowledge the other from within your particularist framework. Not actually encounter the other in a lived experience of negativity. Just talk about it. If you talk about it, great. You know, Christians can talk about loving the neighbor, and then Ivan Illich, as you know, was like, well, no, your neighbor's the guy you encounter on the side of the road, not the person you talk about loving in church, the one who surprises you, right? So everything, so let's put it this way.
Yeah, the neighbor is the person you feel like disgust for.
That's correct.
That was one of his main points, yeah.
Basically, the economic system penalizes anyone who encounters the person that disgusts them. Until that changes, until that shifts and the incentive structure changes, the economy will contribute to our ultimate self-effacement. You might, and the way, as you know, we talked about in Illich, and Belonging Again 2.1 talks about, it's the difference, and we talked about it last time with Cadell, it's the difference between preparing and planning. We have an economic system now that is all about planning for the future, right? Planning what you need to be sustainable, planning what you need to do to succeed, or planning for what the future holds. That all planning almost always is going to end up particularist. It almost has to, because you have to think about the future in line with your particular notions of what the future is and what is best, right? So, but how do you make an economically sustainable model that is not coming up with a 5-year plan or a plan for economic sustainability that would actually be sustainable without a plan, right? Well, that would require economic shifts in the value form. And let me just sum it up this way. Basically, for the sublation of capital, because right now, like this idea of throwing out capital, there is no other system that can deal what's called with the knowledge problem of Friedrich Hayek or the coordination problem of von Mises, which is the pricing mechanism. You throw out capitalism, you throw out that, and you have mass poverty. Okay, so now that's a big claim I just made. I'd have to go into all of that. But if you throw out capitalism without sublating it, you're in trouble. Okay, but if you're going to sublate capitalism, this can't be through a rebellion, as Cadell was saying. I think that case is made very strong in Coratani and others. You have to sublate the value form, the very form by which people make judgments on what is valuable and what is not. And right now, basically, as Marx talks about in the beginning of Capital, Volume 1, is the value form is the abstract idea of labor. Things have value to the degree we believe they took a lot of labor to make. Labor quantifies. Like a diamond is worth a lot because it's hard to get a diamond. It takes a lot of labor to get a diamond. So you say that is more valuable than water, because Adam Smith.
Or we equate work with time, right? How much time you spend on something.
That's correct. And so the time, because there's also a distinction between labor and work. Like work, I could go out in the field and dig a hole, but there's not really value there because I can't exchange it. I'm just toiling. Labor is when I do something where there's a sociological structure that values it and I can exchange it. Okay, so the labor fits into the exchange, the pricing, and all of that, right? So the value form of capitalism is tied to an abstract idea of labor. Now, there's more to get into with that argument. This is what has to be sublated. And what it has to be sublated to is we have to value creative destruction. And this is all the creativity. This is Shumter. This is technology. This is innovation. This is the subject. We hate creative destruction in capitalism. We pass laws to stop it. We create monopolies to keep it from happening. We have intellectual property rights so it doesn't occur. And we make people create plans for their future so they're incapable of creativity and intrinsic motivation to engage in creative destruction. So you have no creative destruction in capitalism. Well, guess what? If Shumter is correct and Dietrich McCloskey and all these people, and then I'll pass it on, that actually what creates wealth, actually what creates a sustainable, thriving society is creativity, and ultimately, therefore, creative destruction, because the new things you create destroy the old, electricity gets rid of whale oil and all of that. Well, then capitalism, to be sublated, has to be an incubator, not of increasing asset value or abstract ideas of labor, but an incubator of subjects who can handle creative destruction. I love the phrase creative destruction because destruction is negativity and creativity is positive. So that's the negativity that has a particular universality that is bound by a process of creative destruction. That guess what? If we do not do this, then capitalism goes into a great stagnation. We lose wealth and we end up in geopolitical crises. But then the funny thing is, who would have ever thought that creating a society of subjects that can handle creative destruction would involve psychoanalysis and dealing with the real? Creative destruction always entails the real. Creative destruction in the Shumter way is the breaking through of the real. Oh, you thought you were going to be able to make a career out of whale oil? Here's electricity. Oh, you thought you were going to be able to make a career out of, working it? Here's AI, right? So this is the creative destruction. But if you had subjects who were prepared for creative destruction, who could encounter creative destruction and respond to it, then you wouldn't have all these pathological destructions. So the sublation of capitalism is a value form of creative destruction. But then what does that look like in education, schooling, infrastructure, so on? But let me pass it on.
Interesting. I was thinking of Cadell's phrase about small pleasures. And I think what we don't want to destroy is our small pleasures. And that's often what keeps the stagnation in the society. Passing on to you, Cadell.
Well, there's a lot that I could speak to here. I just want to speak to maybe 3 dimensions, and I'll try my best to bring it into some sort of coherence. There's a theme that I've been trying to emphasize in this podcast about the problem of, or the trap potentially of, getting caught in particularity. I think that we have to find, in order to deal with that, I think we have to find a way to speak about community in a positive way, while at the same time situating community itself in its proper place. And I would say that the way we do that is to, and there's huge consequences if we don't do that. And I think Daniel was pointing towards that in regards to the problem of building a community to identify with self-similarity. You just build a community of people that just identify the same way as you. But how can you be the type of being that potentially betrays your own community? How can you be the type of being that actually transgresses the boundaries of your own community? Well, there's 2 ways in which you can do that. And I mean, do that sustainably in some sense, is that you have to understand both what I would call the down of community and the up of community. The down of community is the family, meaning you have to have a good family base if you're going to be able to have the care that you need to betray your own community. Then on the up of community, it would be the state. And so the state would be basically the place where you get the commitment to universality. And if you're really oriented towards the state on the level of universality, then you will naturally be able to transgress your community in a way that is coherent to that community. Like, for example, I've been able to do this, and actually I was listening to a podcast where Sam Harris claims that he's been able to do this as well, which is Sam Harris has been able to jump from wildly different topics to different topics. Like, I was an atheist, but then I became a spiritualist. Then I was doing Buddhism. Then I was doing psychedelics. Then I was doing something else. He's always transgressing his own community boundaries. And in that way, he's constantly always shaking up his community boundaries. But Sam Harris both has a grounded family, and Sam Harris is also oriented towards universality on the level of a professional professor. So he's able to do that, and that's what that's the sweet spot. And so that's something that I've struggled with, but I think I've been able to do it as well. I'm able to stay with my, and the stakes there is that you're able to stay with your drive, and the drive is the thing. And if you stay with the drive and you nest it between family, community, and state properly, then you can easily continue to transgress community and thus avoid the problem of becoming trapped in a particularist loop with the community. I think the next really interesting thing, I'm going to skip one and just go to another one, which is basically the value of our work. So I think we are, and because of AI today, I think largely that's really the historical moment, contemporary technology, the problem of artificial intelligence. And we don't know what our work is worth. And we don't know how our work actually serves the other. There's a huge issue of supply and demand, and our communities have not thought this very well. So if there's no demand for what you're doing, what you really want to create, then your supply doesn't have an audience. It's completely valueless. Then there's a huge problem though, is you have to identify, is my product, is my work, is my supply bad? Do I need to rethink my work, what I'm doing? Or is it that people want it, but they don't know they want it? Right? So this is, and this is particularly difficult for philosophy. This is particularly difficult for the weird work
creating a demand for philosophy, and is that what you mean?
The thing is that many people don't know that they want philosophy.
Right.
So this is the issues. Like I create,
they don't know what it is.
They might not know what it is. They might not know how to interact with it. They might have no idea what the immediate utilitarian output or value of the thing is. And they won't be able to quantify what the value, like for example, there are several students at Philosophy Portal who have been with Philosophy Portal for years. And if you ask them what they got, why they stay, what they get out of it, it's difficult to put in words. It's not like they get an immediate career advancement. It's not like they're making a lot of money now. It's nothing like that. But they are staying and they are getting a deep value out of it, which is difficult to conceptualize, which is difficult to put in words. It's something about it's something about building subjectivity itself. It's something about building subjective character. It's something
and friendships too, right? It's both those things. It's building your own subjectivity, but it's also, Ivan Illich he talked a lot about the creativity of philia, friendship. And I think these communities develop, different kinds of friendship, and working with people who you have this resonance with and friendship with is different than my job at work that I have to go to. And so there's so much more drive in that than there is in an ordinary 9 to 5, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it has to do with something which is difficult and even impossible to put in a clear capitalist categorization of a value form. It's something which is you can't put a price on friendship. You can't put a price on the subjective capacity and the subjective character to engage difficult texts, or the value of your day-to-day thinking process because you've tarried with those difficult texts, and your capacity to engage in conversations and think things and visualize the world and analyze the world in a way that you had never been able to because you had not tarried with a community that was engaged, and also that your own capacity to think and write. And what does it mean to develop a writing project? That is a hugely transformative process to be able to do that. And so it's a huge problem for the types of things we're doing, is that many people would actually benefit enormously from these types of activities, like, for example, Daniel Gardner's course coming up at Parallax. But it's hard to know in advance what I will, in some simplistic, selfish sense, get out of it. right? And that's what usually people need to pull the trigger on participating in such activities. So just on a final point, in relation to what Daniel was saying about enduring creative destruction, or rather that we hate creative destruction, is that to do the types of things we're doing in a long-term mediation, you have to be the type of being that can endure creative destruction. And I'll just say as a very final point is that big businesses today are stopping this. Big businesses today are not capitalist. Big businesses today are not capitalist because they're stopping the creative destruction. They're stopping the fair competition. They want to become gods who are immune from creative destruction. Of course, I don't want to speak for God, but I think God can handle a little creative destruction. I'll just end with that.
Wonderful. Just one footnote. I'm sorry to keep jumping in here. I can't help myself, but I really like I've been thinking about the notion you said that you have to betray your community, and you're using that in a positive sense. And usually the word betrayal it's one of the deadly sins, right? Betrayal. So it requires facing a lot of terror if you're going to go against your community. But I think it's a great idea to positivize that in the sense that, you're not to be beholden to things that are, let's say, not yours or that you're just clinging on to for security reasons. So that's my little footnote. Daniel.
Magnificent, absolutely magnificent. Well, I would say, you have to risk being seen as betraying your community to go on your creative work, right, to be praying versus the plan. So you have to risk being seen as a sinner. You have to be seen as a failure, which I know Cadell was teaching on the complicated and very important notions on the relation between good and evil and Hegel and the philosophy of right, and this idea that you can't do the good unless you risk being seen as evil. You can't, and you see, but then here's the key. If you do not have a sociological horizon or hermeneutic that is even aware of that possibility, then there is no possibility of people practically responding to what they see as evil as going, wait a minute, maybe this is good and I should be open to seeing how it unfolds. They will not do that in the name of love, rationality, pragmatism. They'll kill it. And then that creative unfolding will be stopped. And if creativity is actually at the very essence of capitalism, without which it stagnates and dies, then in the name of pragmatism, of doing what's right and doing whatever, we will engage collectively in auto-cannibalism. And that is what I would refer to as Cadell was saying, the universal meta-crisis. The meta-crisis is basically a collective auto-cannibalism for all the right reasons. This is the key dimension that I think could be missed with the meta-crisis, because often if we talk about it in a way that says, well, if people were just smarter, if they just knew the truth, if they were just more moral, if they just weren't so competitive, if they just weren't so self-centered or whatever, then we would avoid the meta-crisis. No. Giant collective meta-crisis-like events are a result of a collective notion of the good that is not attuned enough to the potential irony of the good, actually being a hidden activity that is collectively leading to a suboptimal result or Nash equilibria. That's one of that we don't have enough irony in our thinking. Despite all of our talk of Kierkegaard's and Hegel's and different things, we do not take seriously enough that human subjectivity is actually in its own nature, without going into too much detail, prone to irony, prone to doing that which they think is good and practical and going to create wealth, being exactly what doesn't. If you take that seriously, then you start thinking differently about ways to deal with the universal. What would a universal be that took seriously the human propensity to irony? That would be a very important thing. That would take seriously that the categories of good and evil are not so easy to tell apart. And in fact, we may have to do what looks evil or seems like a waste of time precisely to engage in something perhaps more sainthood. This cannot be stressed enough, which actually then, without going into it, suggests why, in my opinion, as paradigms for ethics, we need to think more about beauty versus good versus evil. This kind of attraction, absolute idea, and so on and so forth. Now, that was a big claim, but I will move on. Basically...
No, wait, this is important. Don't move on, because I love this. Sorry. Because I think this is just so important, this idea of, it's almost, it's Ivan Illich's idea of counterproductivity as well. We have these sterile notions of the good. We have cliche notions of the good, and it's often good opinion or good behavior or the superego, which is dictating those terms. And the real good, or what closer to the beautiful, is so often a transgression of that in the eyes of others. And that's what makes it difficult. That's what makes this whole process difficult, as Cadell was suggesting.
Well, if you're not willing to possibly be seen as evil or wasting your life or impractical or not caring about the people around you, then how can you ever possibly help them to escape the tyranny of their good ideas? How can you ever possibly help people escape Nash equilibria, notions that are leading to suboptimal results, or one day them waking up and wondering why their life is over and yet they still have 10 years to live or something? You must go beyond the good ideas of today, especially where givens are not given, AI is coming, and all of the ways to plan for the future are increasingly not the case. You have to instead be the kind of subject who is prepared for the unknown, but to do that today, you have to look like you're wasting your potential, which is ironic because that would mean the one who looks like they're wasting their potential could precisely be the one who is making the most of their potential. But if that is not even a category in your worldview, such ironic activity, there is no possibility in being open to that. And I think where Hegel and philosophy of right is basically like philosophy arises as a particular moment in history, which is helping to condition people to freedom, to actually being able to live not in a pre-modern way, but taking the individual seriously, but not in a particularist way. Philosophy then has something to do with making categories like irony in people's minds, helping them actually create values that do not lead to reductionism. And it is a mediating force that is helping us make space for the individual versus a collective givens, but not in a manner that falls into particularist, that actually has a universal singularity. Philosophy, for Hegel, things arrive in the now when they are now needed. And like what I was saying at the beginning, philosophy, like sociology, which I know is a broad word and means many things, that was the revelation of a need of a kind of social philosophy, sociological philosophy that takes really seriously political economy and collective difference and all these different things that begins to arise in the 19th century with your Comtes, with your Webers, Marx, they're all talking about this. But capital raced in and did this sociological philosophy for us, because sociological philosophy is the capacity to basically create value forms or to formulate yourself according to a value that you believe is worth living, a motivative drive. Value and drive are always tied together, like Cadell was saying, right? Well, you having a drive that the people around you don't understand is really hard. Well, capitalism came in and said, no problem, buddy. We'll create a collective notion of what should drive you, and that will be making wealth, that will be having a status, that will be having a career. And please note, that arose when it arose following Hegel, probably for good reason. We needed that time to get to this place now where we might be able to transition to a more vivid and explicit understanding of philosophy, because you're at the kind of saturation point, if you will, that Ebert said, of global capitalism being able to address the problems of global pluralism without falling into pathologies. Well, the time's now for pathology, so we need to recover this thing that started to emerge and has been developing in the 18th century. Cadell had a piece recently that I love, The Revenge of Philosophy. That's such a great title. That is now. That is now, and it has something to do with the mediating of all of these tensions. But if that is so, then you have to have an education system that would make people associate the learning of philosophy as a good thing to do. And right now, philosophy is extracurricular, extra. It's not something you have to do, right? Well, that creates subliminal subconscious associations as philosophy as a niche, as something that's just kind of fun, not something you actually need to do to be able to subjectively encounter, as a subject encounter, global pluralism without falling back into some sort of pathology or self-effacement, right? So you have to change the associations people have with this kind of activity, and then that would open them up to then learning possibilities of irony, of the need for opening the eye of value, to use, Stein's book and Gaffey, these kind of notions have to be associated with people, which it gets into cultural literature. The last thing I'll say is, critically, people have overly essentialized competition. A lot of the criticisms of capitalism, it's competitive, it's exploitative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Absolutely, it can be that. But you see, Underneath capitalism, you know, we talk about supply and demand, right? All of that is within the framework of supply and demand. Guess what? Supply and demand is a top creativity. This is where we've messed up in our economic theory. There would be no supply and there would be no demand if there was no creative destruction. And creativity, like Cadell was saying, you need to show people that they don't know that they want. Yes, that's the history of capitalism, is people being introduced to something they didn't know that they wanted, then they demand it, and then the laws of supply and demand come in, right? Then marketing and all of these come in. What we have done is separated capitalism in terms of just a science of supply and demand, basically, from creativity. Therefore, we're trapped within a logic that is only framed in supply and demand. It has no openness, creativity. Thus, there is no space for preparing versus planning, and thus it stagnates. And you see, this is where when you read like a Stiglitz or Robert, because like all these different people are like, it seems like creativity is really important. Huh? And they move on back to supply and demand because they don't know how to think it. They don't know how to freaking think it. It is the heart and soul of what makes capitalism. It's not competition. It's not creating it's not making money or profit or whatever. It's about creative destruction. So this is the rub. Everything then, in terms of political economy, is creating the infrastructure to incubate as much creative destruction as possible, which would also mean as much freedom of speech as possible, because speech and encountering difference and creativity are very tied together. Dietrich Miklowski talks about the freeing of speech. Jonathan Rout is what creates creative destruction and ideas and knowledge acquisition, right? You need to remove the certification, the monopoly, the laws, all of anything in your government, in your state, that is hindering creative destruction is what you remove to bring about an incubation and association of people with creative destruction. Because here's the problem. Like there was this it's like right now, the very explosion of Silicon Valley is kind of evidence that there's a subconscious understanding that creativity and entrepreneurship matters, but then it immediately was sucked back into techno-feudalism, right? You know, there was an explosion of creative possibility, but all that happened is it went toward monopoly because we didn't change the value forms of the society. So all that happened is you had, wait, maybe creativity is important. Nah, back to the monopoly form, because you didn't change the laws, you didn't change the certification, you didn't change the relationship of the state and the market. So there was a glimmer of a truth of capitalism that was immediately absorbed into what Bauhaus talks about as a feudalism and something like that, right? You have to change intellectual property rights. There's so much talk about overturning the state, rebelling against the state. We don't talk enough about particular laws, particular ways of forming contracts, as I know Cadell was stressing. That's what you need to focus on. Ways that the school is done, the testing systems. These create associations of what people think is practical, the way corporate entities can form to shut down creative destruction. Those are the things that you need to change, which would then sublate the state as opposed to destroy the state. So it's all about infrastructurally opening up as much creative destruction as possible, which then, and then I'll pass it on, what that does is it never allows you to have a stable value form. You're never allowed to simply value things according to one thing, because tomorrow they may be destroyed and replaced with some new creation. Everything is constantly in flux, but not in a chaotic way, because it has to go through a market test. And the only things that the market will support that are creatively generated are that of which address a real concrete problem. You see, it's the idea and the concrete have to meet. Like creative destruction you don't make anything unless it actually addresses the real world or real problems and real stuff, right? So you have flux, you have evaluation of that creative destruction, but it has to address concrete, the actual and the particular. But that means you need to infrastructurally incubate that as much as possible and have people associate that as the proper way to act in the market, properly act as a human being. And suddenly, all these communities like a philosophy portal, like philosophy, one of the reasons you don't know, like you're not sure what this is going to do for you, you're like, what am I getting out of this? Is because what it's doing for you is preparing you for being able to handle creative destruction that you cannot predict until it appears. But then when it appears, you know suddenly and all at once that it's a real good thing that you did those things that at the time you didn't know you were going to need, because creativity is always outside of prediction. If it wasn't, the corporations would have already created it so they didn't lose their monopoly power. Creative destruction. Like
creativity is always comes from the outside in.
Yes.
It's never created in the cosmopolitan center. That's just where it becomes propped up. But all the great poets, the philosophers, they come from the outside towards the center. So there has to be a boundary. There has to be a way for them to get through that boundary. And when the boundaries become hermetically sealed, then you have these terrible monopolies where no creative novelty, nothing new can enter the system.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I see it.
100%, 100%. And so basically you have laws, you have propping up asset value so nobody can own property because then you can speculate through the different markets. You have all of these forms that are making it a wall so no creativity can enter. And for Ebert's work, and then I'll pass it on, creativity is surprising. If you can predict it, it's not really creativity. It's just a new notion, right? It has to be, so creative destruction is always surprising. Otherwise, the pre-existing entities would stop it, right? But then this is a big problem because the corporations with their AIs and computers are really effing smart. So they're going to be able to predict a whole lot of stuff. So the probability of having active creative destruction that is actually able to stop monopoly power will require all hands on deck. Everyone, all kids, all human beings on planet Earth through all education systems need to be free to participate in this activity. And that doesn't mean you remove careers or you remove other options, but you always have a very vibrant, thriving flow of creative destruction, or else it will be too limited for the corporations not to predict it. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like right now, it's too limited, so it can usually be predicted and stopped ahead of time. But if it was more vibrant, because you had an entire collective education system that was about incubating that, you would very likely have some percentage of creative destruction that was surprising, that would break up monopoly power, and also cultivate subjects to be able to handle and participate in that very creative destruction.
I've got more to say, but I want to hear from Cadell.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to say, but I think that from my point of view, what we're facing and what Daniel's course might help us think through is actually the possibility that we are entering the driver's seat of civilization, and we've never actually been in the driver's seat of civilization. So there have usually been a few people driving civilization, and there's been a technological apparatus which has been erected around the planet. But this technological apparatus is facing, I think, each and every one of us with the choice of whether or not we can embody the drive. And by embodying the drive, I want to say that, and in juxtaposition to how I started this podcast, which is sort of the life of simple pleasures, in the opposition between the ontological givens, and ontological givens are the opposite of driving. Ontological givens are just given to you. It's the scaffolding that you don't have to think. In the loss of these ontological givens, we're opened into the risk of just falling into simple pleasures and living a life in that way. But there's a possibility that what we're being initiated towards is the capacity to drive, which is to really steer this thing, and this will have to involve things like in being the type of being that can embody and endure creative destruction, confronting our own good and evil, at the core of our own being. I just want to say, like, really the final thing is perhaps a pathway to socialism, a pathway to a form of governance that can sublate capitalism, would be possibly this move from a capitalism which is based on simple pleasures to a capitalism which is based on the hard road. So in this juxtaposition between a capitalism based on simple pleasures, in that model, capitalism is giving people what they think they want. And so, I mean, capitalism can easily do that. And it takes no consciousness, it takes no self-reflection, it takes no real deep struggle to be able to recognize, actually, you don't need that, you don't want that. Towards a capitalism based on the hard road, which is being driven by things that people don't know that they want, because precisely because it's not based on desire. It's based on drive. And so this shift from a capitalism based on desire to a capitalism based on the hard road, I don't know how that spreads. Totally honest, I don't know how that spreads. That's a mystery. But
it's very counterintuitive, right? Because we think of capitalism as the easy, right?
Well, capitalism exploits our base senses. And so in some sense, it's difficult to think about. It would require a transformation of subjectivity. Paradoxically, in the current culture war, I was framing it as doomer pill, Christ pill. It could be paradoxically that people taking the Christ pill are transforming their subjectivity in such a way as that they're preparing themselves for a hard road. And outside of the Christ pill, it could be people who are going through spiritual religious transformations in general. People who are going through spiritual religious transformations in general, we could call this, for example, John Vervaeke's The Silk Road Project. If we were to say the Silk Road Project is opening up a multipolar conversation about the hard road, in that situation, that hard road then would open up to the possibility of a capitalism of the hard road.
I think what that would require, from my point of view, is people to suffer a lot, or at least come to know their own suffering. Because the problem with the capitalist easy road is it provides a place where you don't know your own suffering. In fact, you think things are pretty good. And they're not.
Absolutely. So to know your own suffering, whatever. So like the zero level, and then I'll close it. The zero level is to know your own suffering. There are various spiritual religious traditions which offer a variant of that pathway. There are also spiritual and religious identifications which actually are designed to prevent you confronting your suffering, and their defenses against so it's very important that, like, there are people who have lived their whole life as religious but need to fall out of the religion in order to suffer. So it's not so clear to me how much we learn by people's consciousness identification with a certain religion. I don't think we learn too much by that.
No, I wasn't arguing for that.
No, I'm just saying I think this is something we have to watch for. I'm just saying that the key thing is that if people are on a zero level putting in the real work on the level of what I would call self-relating negativity, what you might call knowing your own suffering, is that we open up the conditions of possibility for a capitalism based on things that people don't know that they want. And so that inverts capitalism in an interesting way. And it could be, and this is just very speculative, it could be that opens up a different pathway to socialism, because it requires a type of Here's the weird thing with socialists and communists usually, is that they're horrible with socializing. They're not fun to be around. They're not fun to talk to. They don't do social life well at all. And so what that paradoxically means is that we need to generate the type of subjectivity that is actually capable of society, that is actually capable of deep socialization. That's not given. And I want to just say that and this is why the psychoanalytic angle is important, is because we're born in an incredibly antisocial state. When we're born, the other person is a burden. The other person is a nuisance. The other person is a dependence, and the other person is an obstacle. But to become a truly socialized person is to actually be in touch with our fundamental drives, our fundamental motivations, which are at the same time the key of our creativity, which are oftentimes what consciousness doesn't want to know anything about. which is my desire to kill, my violence, my need for recognition, my desire for revenge, my simple eating habits, my desire to just put myself in a hallucinatory state, my sexual inclinations and passions. All of these things are things people don't want to know about too much. And so what we're doing is hopefully again, I would reference, perhaps, I don't know whether Vervaeke's project of the Silk Road is also pointing in this direction, but a spiritual work that's transforming this core of our subjectivity in such a way as that we're the type of beings that could inhabit a socialist project. And so I think that's maybe where I think the stakes are in this conversation and Daniel's work, and hopefully the course.
Yeah. I think the Silk Road is a great analogy, because it is communities which have a, let's say, it's a series of different communities. It's not one totalizing community, and yet there's an economic flow between the communities. So it combines the best of both worlds. Daniel.
I'm so glad you said that, because that was so big, as the Silk Road entails trade. There's an economic reality that is part of that. And so if we're talking about some kind of sublation of the Silk Road, I think what Cadell is saying, a capitalism of drive, a Silk Road of drive, where you are encountering other people to incubate drive, to encounter things you didn't know you wanted. Like, most of the time, people were on the Silk Road because they knew darn well what they wanted, spices or different things, or at the very least, they knew that the other person tended to provide things that they would want, right? What would it mean to go on a road not knowing who you would encounter, what they would offer, and yet trusting in the necessity of encountering the unknown to bring forth to you something that you didn't know you needed to value? Thus, you have drive. But that is going to require a subject that Cadell is saying that can handle socialism, that can handle communitarianism, that can handle global pluralism, because we basically can't frickin' handle global pluralism. We don't know how, because it takes a lot of facing negativity and work, which at this point you're not getting paid to do. So why would you do it? And if you do it, your friends think you're wasting your time. And why aren't you hanging out? Like, you're just spending all your time doing all this philosophy stuff. Why aren't you bowling? You're a bad person. Oh, you have to look like a sinner in order to be a saint, blah, 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 right? So you have to change the incentive structures. And we think about incentives too much merely in terms of economic incentives pay, but there are social incentives, there are social permissionaries, as Abel would say, and different things like that. And if you're going to be talking about spreading a capitalism of drive, you have to spread the social aesthetic and infrastructure of which would make people associate that kind of activity as a good use of time. Or else they're not going to do it, because we're also, on average, they're not going to do it. There will be some random individuals who do it, but you will not have socially, it will not define the majority. And basically, to have a capitalism of drive versus random individual instances of given people that choose to use capitalism for drive, you would need it to spread. You would need it to be more collective, but that would require transformations of various legal frameworks, educational frameworks, certification frameworks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think also on this, the problem is, like, for example, a lot of religions, let's say Christianity, once Christianity moved to being about salvation versus sainthood, that created all sorts of pathologies. Being a saint, like we follow a Teresa or a St. John, is a dark night of the soul, suffering, pain, sickness, and all these other things. Once religion moves away to more so a salvation, it can move away from cultivating drive. And then it's very problematic. And so that has to be addressed. You have to bring back that dark night of the soul, or else you get all these kind of problems. I think capitalism with the hard road is a very good way to put it. And if you do that, the other thing with it that's kind of ironic is when humans, like this idea of we have to have a drive for something we don't know we want, right? You know, we have to want something we don't know we want. We'd associate that with drive, where desire is knowing what you want. Blondel, in his book Action, has one of my favorite kind of ideas in one of those chapters, where he talks about, you know, the problem with knowing something, like if you know something works or you fully understand it, you stop caring about it. It's when something is broken that you notice it, or when you don't know what's going to happen, then you suddenly can be more excited about it. But like he points out, it's like, I don't think about this lamp, I don't think about this bookcase, I don't think about this ceiling, because it's working. You only think about it when it doesn't, right? So here's the paradoxical move. Certainty and making things work destroys motivation, right? So a lot of the meaning crisis is precisely knowing what's going to happen, knowing everything ahead of time. There's no source of excitement or motivation. In sacrificing knowledge of the future, you actually can create a feeling of excitement, anticipation, ambition, and all of these different things. And so this is why also, though, capitalism, when it is desire capitalism is auto-cannibalistic. It eats itself. That's my argument. If you go through the economic literature, I think you can make that argument. So basically, the argument I would like to make is that our historic moment is one right now where if we do not sublate desire capitalism into drive capitalism, we are in trouble. Very, very big trouble. So we have to think this. And a quick way to put why desire capitalism eats itself is because it stimulates demand by you knowing what you want, but following Blondel, when you know what you want, you eventually stop caring about it because it's not interesting to you anymore. So capitalism, there's a limit to how long it can stimulate demand. And if you follow a Keynes, if you follow a lot of these different people, capitalism requires a point where it must stimulate demand or else it falls into a stagnation. My argument is actually what it needs to do is create demand, not stimulate demand, because there's eventually a point where you can no longer do that without, here's ultimately what occurs. The way you do it is by increasing asset value or the equity market, which inevitably is debt, which inevitably benefits the older generation at the younger generation, and it forces various monopoly forms. That's how you stimulate demand, and you just keep kicking the can down the road as long as possible until it doesn't work anymore. That is how desire capitalism has to go if it's not going to become drive capitalism. Drive capitalism would require subjects that can be driven by something that they don't know about ahead of time. That's the only kind of subjectivity that can create demand versus merely have their demand stimulated by something external to them, right? That is the only way capitalism does not become pathological, and it is the exact same move of saving capitalism, if you will, that makes socialism and communitarian possible. This is the key. This is where Marx is like capitalism kind of sublates into communism. Well, this is the issue. The very thing that keeps demand in capitalism from becoming self-destruction, which is the work on the subject, is the very thing that makes the subject able to handle pluralism and socialism and handle negativity. It's the same move. That's why there's hope in it. Because if you had to do them separate, like somehow make subjects able to be ready for socialism while at the same time keeping the economy propped up, you might be screwed because it would be too much or they would be conflicting projects and they would counter. But if it's actually the same move, the development of the subject to handle negativity to be followed by drive versus demand, if that is the same move of which has capitalism be sublated in creating wealth and creative destruction, of which is the making of the subjects able to handle socialism, then there is hope, if you will. Ivan Illich always said we needed more hope, right? But this is the fun, and then I'll pass it on. This is a kind of faithful presence, though, because you have to do a work without a guarantee of knowing what the outcome is going to be, believing if you could create the conditions that would make a few more people driven by drive versus desire, and then a few more people driven by desire versus drive, and then I'm going to talk about the medium condition versus the material condition, et cetera, so forth. But if you could do that and have a faithful presence, which James Hunter argues in his book is what actually changes the world, not plans, but works of preparation and places of influence. That's why Hunter's book is very important. If you could actually do that, then you could deal with these problems, but you have to have a kind of faithful presence to the work now without any guarantees of what's going to happen, not because it's just saying that to be comfortable with it, but because that is literally the only possible structure that could create drive versus desire. Faithful presence, given everything we've said, to the work, to the filling, the turling, just doing what you need to do. It is logically the only kind of structure that could do all the things we're discussing, given that we're talking about incubating the capacity to be driven versus stimulated by demand. That means you can't plan, you can only prepare, and there's reason looking at history to actually see that that is what has made the world what it is. It is this kind of faithful presence and this kind of faithful work.
So we belong when we're in the drive, it would appear.
Yes. Yes.
This is one thought I had. We don't belong when we're kind of lost among the simple, pleasures And also my other thought was you said that we don't really become interested in something unless it's broken, and that to me is the spiritual power of, I defend Christianity sometimes because the brokenness of human, acknowledging our own brokenness, rather is kind of a place to start, in terms of belonging again. So those are the two thoughts I had as you were talking. And do you guys want to, should we begin to wrap this up? I'm perfectly fine. I have time, Cadell. If you have more things that you want to, put on the table, it's great. It's great with me. But
I don't have any time commitments. If you guys want to just continue to chop it up, I'm good to keep going.
okay, well, so any, further, do you want to elaborate further on some of these ideas?
Well, I mean, we belong in the drive. I mean, I think it's an interesting thought, precisely because if we think about belonging in the drive, I think that's a good defense against the type of belonging which is modeled on this type of retroactivity, meaning the type of retroactivity of make America great again or something like that. Like that there's some belonging we've lost and we have to reclaim this belonging or something like that. And this is precisely probably a image or a structure of the psyche which is tired of movement in some sense, doesn't want to be alive, wants some sort of ideal in the past. Psychoanalytically speaking, it could be some sort of Oedipal fixation of some kind.
Yeah. So there's a desire to go back to the Garden of Eden or something like that.
The same
but actually
thing
the forward trajectory is to build the city of God. That's a more alive metaphor.
But I think drive should be juxtaposed against both the retroactivity of the past and also a perfect teleological future. Like drive belongs where it is. Like, and this is the weird thing, is that the past is horrible. Like there's nowhere in the past to go back to, but we also can't predict the future. And so this is where we belong in this space where we are right now. And the important thing to me, I don't know how to think about building the kingdom of God. It's this in communism, it's building the world communist utopia. There's different variations on some sort of utopia. It appears in the game A, game B thing. Like we're in game A, right? We're trying to build game B. The crucial thing here is to stay with the present moment of the drive. It's so important because, like Daniel said, creativity is by its nature surprising, which means if we open up a space where people can create, by definition, we can't know what the future will be, because the future is just the totality of our creations, which we don't know what our own intervention will cause, and then in turn change our very ontological conditions of action. So actually, both this desire for a past state and this desire for a future state are obfuscations of our own creative agency, but perhaps even more the creative agency of others.
But what about, don't we have to have a somewhat of a positive notion of our activity as moving forward in some direction? Even though we're going to die and everybody we know is going to die and we're going to get a disease, and we know that. On the other hand, how do we keep a positive, constructive, drive in the face of that?
So let me just give a concrete example of how I do it. Hopefully it resonates. Is it's about the relationship between drive and the intuitive images that we can get of the future. So I had an intuitive image, I forget the exact date, of what I would like to build related to Philosophy Portal before Philosophy Portal existed. Right? So I had an image in my head of a educational initiative, an online platform. Right? Now, in acting out that image, I, in some sense, had to sacrifice that image. Do you see? So, because in acting out the image, I find out what the image is. And it's going to be different than what the original image is. So if I just keep acting in relationship to what the original image is, it's not going to work. Because I'm actually not interested in what the image is. Right? So what happened always was you have an image. The problem people get is they get an image and then they think that's the image that actually has to be acted out exactly like that.
Oh, yeah.
No, that's a mistake. You have an image, it's pointing in a certain direction, you act on it, you find out what it is, it will change the image, but you'll find out something better in acting it out than in your original image. Many of the projects that came out of Philosophy Portal, the conferences, the anthologies, the retreats, the portal space, I didn't know about any of that in my original image.
Yeah.
That came out of being open to what it is.
In a way, that's what I mean, though, Cadell, when I say the city of God. I don't mean a place that could, like some kind of architecture that has an absolute architecture. I mean resonating with an image of the highest possible thing, and then bringing that into actuality based on one's own, acts in life, and that is actually finding it in the moment. It's not finding it in the future. There's kind of a paradox there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm just trying to emphasize this crucial moment that whatever we think is the higher future is just the future in the present.
Yes.
It's not the actual future, can't be the actual future. And the problem is that there's a certain subjective shift inside oneself of being able to both image a higher future and destroy that image if necessary.
Nice.
And that has to come in relation. That's creative destruction.
Yeah. So Daniel,
I think that was all brilliant. A way I think about it is that it's kind of, I think about the hip hop cipher a lot in forming community now. And the way the cipher is so interesting is there is some kind of plan. We're going to come together at this time, and these people are going to be there. There is some logistics, but you cannot predict ahead of time what kind of hip hop is going to emerge in the cipher because it's off the dome. The improv comedian, the improv music, there's planning to make a condition of unpredictability. I think that's the move. Planning is in service of preparing, not planning and no preparing, is to use the kind of language I would. So the way I think about it is whatever the future holds, I'll be able to handle it. Like you're working on yourself as a subject because you're planning for the future in the sense of you'll be prepared for whatever life throws at you. Likewise,
and a good rapper is always in the flow, right? No matter what, even if he has the worst possible sound system and situation,
you can make it work.
It's just being tough enough and dynamic enough and attuned enough to make it work no matter what.
Well, and to me, going back to Ivan Illich, the man on the side of the road, the proper way to respond is to be like the hip hopper. When you encounter a guy on the side of the road, you're ready to go. When you encounter diversity and difference, you're ready to go. Like you're able to stay in the flow. And there's a way to use that example where the hip hop artist they're always in flow, but there are different intensities of the flow because they're always able to kind of use whatever's thrown at them and actually work with it, right? That is the kind of subjectivity, and that is the kind of community that is more so on the side of preparing than planning, and that would also be drive. Because the moment you say always in the flow,
I would associate, we talked about in the course, the first course on self-forgetfulness. You're not thinking about the anxious, can I handle what life throws at us? Will I be able to do it? It's like, no, I am. So you just forget about yourself because you're so trained, so prepared that you don't have to think about what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Want to do? You can just flow, right?
So that's the key, isn't it? It's practice and training. Yeah. It's like what Sloterdijk says about you must change your life. You become the acrobat, right? You become so good at what you do that that you're always creating this kind of kingdom of heaven, if I can use that metaphor, wherever you go. I mean, that is possible. It is possible to be so attuned that I think you can even manage death, but that's it's putting it at a high bar.
Philosophy is the training ground for the encounter of diversity. Like, it is the practice of the ability to encounter and be surprised by difference and not regress. Like, that's what it was. It's emerging in the 19th century as globalization. Sociology, which I would argue is supposed to be a revelation of a certain character of philosophy that I think is very Hegelian, is emerging in the 19th century saying, hey, y'all need to start training at this. And instead, we had capitalism come in and do our diversity for us, which worked for like 100, 200 years. I'm not even like bashing that because it had a historic necessity, because we did not at the time have a response to the knowledge problem of Hayek, the coordination problem of von Mises. We did not have these different things. And also capitalism emerges critically following Dietrich McCloskey because of an explosion of wealth creation in the Dutch Empire. And then you needed the industry to actually spread that technological innovation to other people. So it had a historic necessity, but there's a glimmer there of a kind of subjectivity that would be needed that now we are recovering. So when Zizek's like, we need to go back and interpret, it's like a recovery of something that was glimmered but covered. And I actually think often in history, a lot of the most important things we need to learn are like that. You could say religions often, like there's a kind of subject of Jesus glimmers and then goes because it's covered by some sort of like salvation narrative, and there's like a recovery that a lot of thought has. And it's interesting because sublation has this kind of recovering in the now, bringing everything in conversation what's going on. And to me, the glimmer of sociology in the 19th century, as I call tragic sociology, that I think was covered up with a kind of power spotting sociology, now I'd have to get into that recovering that and thinking about that as what we actually need to practice, that is something like the hip hop artist that is able to stay in the flow despite whatever diversity and difference they encounter. That's the kind of subjectivity we need. And a way to think about it, because yeah, I'm basically belonging again is about belonging drive. Drive and belonging are two sides of the same coin. The problem is there's a difference, we could say this, there's a difference between belonging as drive and desiring belonging. Desiring belonging tends to be regressive, desire capitalism, extrinsically stimulating, so on. Belonging in drive is belonging again in a non-regressive way. But here's the issue. If you get drive, if you become the kind of subject who is capable of belonging in your creativity, to use the language Cadell has talked about, and I've talked about intrinsic motivation, belonging, intrinsic motivation, but you don't have an economic system that would sustain you in that drive, the belonging is fragile and it collapses, right? So you have to be able to raise children in belonging drive, you have to have property in belonging drive, you have to have contracts in belonging drive, and you have to have the ability to have people value what you're doing, or else you can't market and spread and make sustainable money. This is why valuation is important, because if you're doing this, but people don't understand it, or they're not able to value it because they haven't been taught the value of philosophy, then they're not going to invest in a philosophy portal and OG Rosa Parallax, right? So how do you spread the conditions of an increased probability that more and more people would see value created there? Well, you have to change the value form, and you have to make people associate the kind of subjectivity that can handle diversity as important, and you have to make the case that philosophy is the training ground of the subjectivity of drive that can handle diversity. But then, so this is the giant, like, tricky move. How do you create a society that doesn't inform people they need to be like that, but formulates people into being like that because of their associations of what's a good use of time based on how they experience the world? This, without going into it, but it's very big. Because you have to go through history and show that actually subjectivity and culture are made aesthetically. They are made by an environment that incubates a certain ethic of what they are subconsciously supposed to do. So if you go through a lot of the sociologists like Pierre, who distinctions, where he talks about the creation of like high culture and low culture on setting at a table, a particular etiquette of how to eat. This sends social signals of classes, right? If you go through and you look at the history of the formulation of capital markets, this is what like Marx will talk about or call Planier and the Great Transformation. You have to change the aesthetic experience, not merely the informational experience of people, to send certain signals to them of what is a good use of time and how they should value things. Please, Mr. Sweeney.
Well, that's just, I mean, continuing the analogy of the rapper, you know, if a good rapper comes along, people start to pay him millions of dollars, right? The values is because of his particular skill and because people value that. So I guess like the art, I guess what Cadell needs to do is how do you get people to see the value of something so hard and I guess still elitist as philosophy?
Well, I mean, it's at the same time, I don't think the solution is that everyone needs to study philosophy. I don't think that's I don't think everyone needs to do everything, but
Or be a rapper. But I mean, like, not everybody needs to do rapper, but how do you get people to gravitate around the central image of, you know, let's say a Socrates or something like that
I think
tells
that
people that the philosopher is important in the society.
I think that I think that the great opportunity and the great challenge of living in the age we're living in, and specifically the horizon of what I would call like a open liberal society, which has made many simple pleasures excessively available, is that people can find out very quickly, or quicker than ever before, just how empty they are. And that's, I think, the super interesting thing about living at the time, because at almost every time previously in history, people weren't able to discover that too quickly. Now I think generations are discovering it quicker and quicker and quicker. And so when you've exhausted the simple pleasures, when you basically, there have been no prohibitions on anything, and you just explore everything, and you exhaust everything in its excess, then I think you start asking yourself questions which basically come down to the question of, well, I guess the hard road's the only road left. And so I think it happens very naturally. I don't think that we need to have some sort of big external force that makes people take the hard road. I think that we need to walk the hard road ourselves, and we need to show by the very motion of our behavior and the very motion and the very results of our work that this is the best possible road you can walk. And it's the inversion. To me, I am totally against proselytization. I don't know what, I don't need to go and convert other people to the way I think. I don't need to go and convert other people to do as I do or believe as I believe. And I think people who do that are non-believers. Like, I think people who are proselytizing, I think they don't believe.
Yeah.
Because you need the other to believe. So your belief depends on the other also in this self-symmetry. I think all we need to do is, I think it's actually like a weird, maybe androgynous reversal, where to me the simple proselytization is just the unreflective masculine. And the person who can just walk the walk and, as it were, become beautiful by their motion, and wait for the people to come if they're so interested is kind of like the masculine that's included the feminine. And maybe you do need to actually include the feminine in order to be such a being, like not like literally, but practically, concretely, like like a relationship to a woman.
Yeah, or
Right?
that is the yogic path in a way. It's like, because if we're if we're a polarized being, then we can't let in the other, right? So we have to, we have to, in a sense, develop those capacities. Like even the military guys develop feminine capacities to care for each other. So there is that, and we have to develop capacities for beauty rather than just declaration or machismo. I think that's correct.
You ask, like, how do you get people interested in philosophy? I mean, I think the question is, how do we get people interested in walking the hard road? And whatever that road manifests, whether it's philosophical, whether it's religious, whether it's artistic, whether it's athletic, whether it's whatever it happens to be, it's how can we be shining lights?
We
And
just
not
have to do
just
it ourselves.
how can we just shine in what we're doing? And like, it's trite, it's cliche, but like, all beautiful surfaces come from a terrible depths, like what Nietzsche said about beautiful surfaces. It's just, if we can, like you said, Sweeney, a certain knowledge of our own suffering, a certain, what I was saying of holding a space of affects but negativizing those affects, that's how you get something beautiful. And so just in our process, that we keep doing work that we think is beautiful, keep doing work that we think is necessary, that people will come, people will find it. And I think everything as it is right now is where things need to be. I don't think we need to worry about like blowing up quickly, like getting a lot of attention very quickly. Like, it's actually a blessing to just have a little bit of attention. I don't want to be thrown into millions of people thinking about what I'm doing.
Also, you want the people who are
build
thinking about what
slowly.
you're doing to be resonating with your authenticity, which is why I asked Daniel to, do this in the first place. When you see somebody as a kind of a pure motivation and they're in it not for any instrumental or manipulative or, marketing thing, then that person, has some depth to them. Okay. And, I want to resonate with that. I don't like the word resonate because it's overused, but I want to sort of be associated with the kind of people that are in it for purely for what you would call the drive. I think that's your word. People who are in it for the drive.
I just want to say very quickly, like, I totally agree. I totally know where you're coming from. I also don't think that we should associate marketing or practical business organization as somehow, impure, or somehow like, oh, you're not pure because you're selling your course, or you're not pure because you're building a business out of this. I think this is not the, like, that's the key, is that to sublate capital means to fully accept capital. And
But it's
Daniel
not primary.
Has,
it's not primary.
like Daniel has a business, Parallax is a business, Philosophy Portal is a business. So I don't think this is actually a shame that we've come to see business as somehow impure, somehow, like, and this is back to like the point I think you made, Sweeney, and you've talked about on Parallax, of like tantra and money, like basically the question of money and spirituality. Like, the reason why these aren't more closely associated, like, is because people think that oftentimes people in the West go to some sort of spiritual pursuit because they're unhappy in their capitalist day job. So they have like a capitalist day job that they hate, and then they go to spiritual practice on the side, and then they think, oh, capital's impure. You know, like this is also false, you know? So I just want to complicate that a bit.
That's good. No, I think I completely think that's a relevant and vital and important point, because because it's also a question of humility. It's a question of having to do the earthly things that we need to do in the world, rather than believing there's some kind of escape from that, which is a childish, maybe a more childish move. And money, you know, dealing with the energy of money, which is it's associated with you know, all of our desires and fears and, you know, complications and neuroses, is something that's like we need to face that head on, I think. And I think that we often avoid doing that for false virtuous reasons.
Magnificent.
Yeah, just totally agree. Totally agree.
Yeah.
Magnificent. So there's a few things. First, thank you for your kind words, Sweeney. And so there's a few things on the question of what changes culture. Is it an effort to change culture, like marketing and proselytizing and different things like that? Or is it something to do with a kind of shine that attracts people in because there is something occurring in the historic episode that makes them receptive of seeing and being attracted by that shine? I think hopefully the book will make the case, is that it is the latter, not the first. Because that's the faithful presence, that's sociology. What you see is, because what we're talking about ultimately is not merely a change in, say, people's like the kind of products they buy or things. We're talking about changing people's value form, to use that Marxian language, like where they would actually value preparing, not just planning. That's a cultural shift. That's going to be relative to an incubation on what people want to do. So we are talking about making people want to have drive, not merely want their desires. These are cultural shifts. When you look back on history and you see what changes culture, it is much more a process of creating a space where something is shining that gradually brings people in, and then culture shifts gradually that way. According to some people talk about soft power, some people talk about kind of like the kind of cultures and different things like that. So if that is true, then if we're talking about some need to move to a drive capitalism versus a desire capitalism, then we're talking about value form. That could allude to Stein's work and different things. Then we're also talking about a faithful presence strategy, which is also a strategy that has something to do with beauty and shine. That is not ignoring money, because here's the issue. A faithful presence strategy is a marathon. You have to last. Well, that means you have to somehow have money. That means you have to somehow make it sustainable without losing your mind. So you need economic support. But the moment you have economic support, you're at risk of losing the shine because you are compromised. So here's the issue. A lot of, different people, attentionalism. We're in an attentionalist economy, right? Well, that's the temptation. Looking at the sociologists, you have to somehow have a more so a kind of shine economy, not an attention, but an attraction. How do you have an attraction model versus an attention model, if you use that language, right? And again, if you look back on history, that's what changes culture. Now, it involves money, it involves politics, and it involves law. So if you say those things are dirty, you have no possibility of actually bringing about an attraction. Okay? And actually what will happen is, as you fail because you've made money dirty, you'll probably become pathological, nervous, overreact, then overcorrect into attentionalism, and then you're just part of the problem, right? A way I think about this regarding like Christian evangelism, there's a wonderful book called The Fourth Temptation of Christ by a man named Malcolm Mulkridge. And he says, imagine that Jesus was in the wilderness and the devil came along and he said, hey, Jesus, I'm going to give you a global media empire. And then everyone will know about Christianity, and you'll be able to spread the message. And Muckridge literally calls this the fourth temptation of Christ. Not because, but what's very interesting is there is a kind of like, don't you want people to be attracted into Christ? Muckridge is suggesting that a global media empire, attentionalism, would actually be a temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. I think there is something similar going on, where the game of attentionalism and keeping up with the night, it's giving into the fourth temptation of Christ in a funny way. But here's the rub, though. You cannot attract people into a new culture unless they know about it. So you have to have some kind of marketing, some kind of information spread, but not one that gives into the fourth temptation of Christ, as I'll call it, because I just love that phrase. How do you do that? How do you spread information about what you're doing so people can see it to be attracted in, but not slip into a kind of marketing that is actually attention-based versus attraction-based? That's an example of the kind of things we have to think now. Now, there are two parts to this. You have to create the infrastructure by which people who are in the faithful presence, shining with the kind of subjectivity that makes possible drive capitalism. There has to be an information flow and transparency so that people can see it to be attracted into it. And at the same time, the people on the outside, if you will, who see it, would then value it when they saw it to let the attraction pull them. So you have two things that have to go on. You have to have people in the clearing, increasing transparency, maintaining the faithful presence, while simultaneously the people outside that faithful presence are transforming to be open to that. Cadell got it. Cadell pointed out very, 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 very well. The very quickness of people encountering emptiness now is actually a frickin' blessing, because what it means is that people are more likely to therefore lift the attraction of this drive, pull them in, precisely because we can put it this way. What do you do if everything you plan for is empty? That's what people are encountering. Everything you plan for is empty. Well, then you need to prepare. The only way to not have freaking emptiness is to prepare. What do you do if all desires are ultimately empty? Well, I guess you need drive. So you have, this is the key. This is how, to say something incredibly bold, this kind of interaction is the logic of historical cultural shift, where you have something, you have communities of faithful presence that are somehow creating enough information flow, sustainability, and transparency to where they can be seen without giving into the fourth temptation of Christ, while at the same time, something is happening outside that makes people receptive to it, seeing of it, willing to be pulled into it, right? The very nihilism that is destroying the youth or whatever is precisely the conditioning of subjectivity to be attracted into drive. So it's all up to us. That, like, it's not something, if you remove that, if you somehow say, well, let's rush in and restore given so people don't encounter emptiness, then you've removed what subjects need to be attracted into these communities of drive. That's the irony. Like, if you remove this emptiness that people are encountering and don't let them encounter it, then they will not have the subjectivity that can be attracted into drive. And they'll just stay on the desire side, which will then lead to self-effacement, global political crises, and different things like that. And so that's why I think it's going on.
It's interesting, like in the Buddhist path, like the experience of emptiness, as it's called, is the beginning of the path. So that is, if people are being pushed into this, en masse, then I think we have this sort of potential for at least a renaissance of culture in some kind of a way, which is very, very interesting.
Let me just say on these points is the beginning is always an emptiness. The beginning is always in a lack. I just want to say this in regards to attention economy, and that attention economy is not, as Bard thinks, a path from capitalism to socialism. That's totally a false narrative. and a distortion of dialectical thinking. Attention is deeply superficial. Attention is the enemy of our current moment. I just want to give a story. If you go on my YouTube channel, just go do a test. Go on my YouTube channel and you go to all the videos section, and then you click popular. All of the videos that have the most views on my channel were a part of this popular science cartoon show that I was doing before I did my doctorate, which was on a contract with PBS Studios. It was paid well and so forth. But when the first video started to get over 100,000 views, I was just sitting there in my room with an emptiness. Like, the attention didn't work. Like, that's not what I was looking for. And that's where I decided, no, I have to go do the doctorate. I have to deepen my knowledge. This popular science route is not what I'm looking for, and so forth. So just saying that this attention is a lure. Attention is preying on a certain subject of desire. It's going through, it's only the beginning when you realize the attention is superficial. It's only the beginning when but the weird thing is, you have to experience the emptiness of it. It's not enough for me to tell you that that's the way it is. You have to do something that gets you whatever attention, and then you have to experience the emptiness of that. And that's the start of the path. So that's the weird thing. I just want to say in relationship to that, because I think Daniel's right when he says, if you try to, the deep irony, if you try to use givens to get rid of emptiness. And by the way, in a recent discussion between Richard Dawkins and Ayaan Hirsch Ali, this was absolutely, I'm on Richard Dawkins' side. Ayaan Hirsch Ali is using the givens of Christianity to get rid of the emptiness. And this is her main argument. It's tempting, but it's, I say, a false path. And this is deeply symptomatic of what I call the doomer pill, Christ pill culture war that's going on, which is a totally false war. This Christian revival, which is going through, exactly like Daniel said, this global media empire, this is all false. The people who are spreading the message of Christianity on YouTube, doing podcasts about it, this is all bullshit. It's deeply compromised, misleading, and we should be very suspect about it.
Well, if that is their reason for embracing Christianity, if it's because it's now socially acceptable enough to do that, then that's probably kind of against the Christian spirit in a way, like on some level.
But I just want to say that we should only view this as positive, as a moment of the dialectic, if they're talking about it, their digital performativity about it actually translates into acting it out and being that without depending on the external propositions of Christianity. And I just want to give an example of what's at stake there, because if we just think we just need to, as Ayaan Hirsch Ali says, we just need to give the next generation the givens of Christianity, this is one, a false project, and two, I'll tell you exactly the type of subjectivity that this leads to. Audrey and I were watching a documentary about Ashley Madison. You know Ashley Madison, the website which was massively popular for 20 years at the beginning of the 21st century that was encouraging couples to cheat on each other. It was encouraging married couples to cheat on each other. And there was a story in the documentary of this Christian guy who was raised Christian, was deeply pious, had a beautiful wife, kids, beautiful house. And then he started to go into the temptation of Ashley Madison. He started to go on the dating site. He started to play around with it. And he was saying in the documentary, he didn't know why he was doing it. But the reason why he was doing it is because he didn't know why he was good. He didn't know why he was good. He had the external image of goodness. I've got the Christian life, my wife, my kids, my house, and blah, blah, blah. But he didn't know his own evil. And so why he was doing it was he was totally destroying his marriage, totally destroying his whole life without even knowing why. And then the weird irony and paradox is, possibly when his life was destroyed by being found out that he was on Ashley Madison, then maybe he could become a Christian. Then maybe he's a Christian for the first time, you know? So I think
So you have to be an antichrist. You have to meet the Antichrist or integrate the Antichrist on some level before.
You have to know
I would
in
say
your
you
soul.
could be a genuine
You have
Christian.
to know in your soul. You can't just be given it. And you
Yeah.
can't just identify as it and then surround yourself with people who also identify as it.
Well, I mean, that's true, like ultimately on an existential level, but on your, you know, most people don't get there to that level. It's a question of like where they're born and what, you know, what works for them. You know, I think of my Polish relatives and very very deep Catholic family, and I think that I think that the givens of Catholicism work for them on some level because they don't, you know, they haven't gone through that next particular stage that you need to go to let's say maybe you know, Christianity has to, within the Christian myth is the death and the resurrection of itself on some level.
I just want to say that we have a certain confrontation with a liberal secular background in a multipolar, multi-faith society. And there are some people who are concerned that because we face this open, liberal multipolarity, that we just need to use the Christian givens to defend against this. And I'm just saying that move is too simple. That actually we should see the openness of the liberal multipolar situation as already the solution. Because people are being exposed to an excess which they've never been exposed to before, which is going to be anxiety-provoking, a negative moment. But the truth is just going into this negative moment and seeing if there's a spontaneous gravitation towards the hard path. This is a truer and a deeper mode of subjectivity. If we just have the givenness of Catholicism or the givenness of Protestantism or the givenness of whatever Islam, then we might, for most people, might be able to live out a simple life that way. But I'm even more and more skeptical of this. I don't think so. It's not working. But the more deeper issue is that we never really are brave to confront the actual subject. We just give them their cage, you know, like just give them their propositions. Like this is also like, I find this to be absolutely, and this is, I think, also why in John Vervaeke's The Silk Road Project, he's totally, I think, against this simplistic identification and propositions, you know, like just give people their given.
He called it
he's
cultural
totally emphasizing the work of the practice, no?
Yeah.
The ecology of practice.
He said he was fully against, in my conversation with him, this revival of cultural Christianity, very against that. If it's cultural Christianity, then it's Christianity of givens. It doesn't mean that he wasn't, you know, very interested in the deeper, you know, meanings of Christianity. Yeah, but yeah, I think it's on the same page there.
Outstanding. So what Cadell was saying about the notion of it's not until after the scandal that you can finally be Christian, like an argument in a weird way is we've never actually had belonging, because it is only until you encounter the emptiness, the void, the negativity, et cetera, so forth, that actual belonging is possible. And if you skip that, what you've had is a kind of simulation of belonging, which critically, I am not saying that therefore in the past everyone was fake or it didn't really work. It was a kind of historically contingent moment that required isolationism, basically. Like it's a belonging based on a kind of thoughtlessness, but it's almost more so thoughtlessness than belonging, and not thoughtless as in stupid, but not examining the kind of givens to realize that they're given, they're not actual in a sense. They're like given to you, and they work because you do not think about them. That's where in part one of belonging, again, kind of the key sections on the value circle and the conflict of society, which is the realization that, oh my gosh, we're at the historic moment where we realize no sociological order can ground itself, that it is always an emptiness at the bottom of every single possible sociological order, and it's based on Kurt Gödel and all these other things. What that means is that every form of belonging in the past that was based on not encountering the emptiness was not actually belonging. It's revealed suddenly and all at once to have always been a kind of blindness or kind of thoughtlessness, of which, practically speaking, worked and functioned as belonging because you never looked at it. But technically, it wasn't actually belonging because you were belonging to something that didn't exist, mainly a reality that was given, but then a given work because you don't think about it as given. It's just isness, right? So that isness was not actually isness. It was
what about
assumed.
like in where I live in Paris, you know, it was once a population of 10,000 people and they all built Notre Dame together.
Sure.
There must have been a sense of belonging there and a sense of,
I'm not saying that there was
that
no
was like, that's like, and a sense of the hard way as well. There must have been both those things because it was a collective activity which created something monumental and beautiful that lasts forever, you know, almost. Rather than just accepting some cultural Christianity because you're afraid the world's gonna, you know, collapse and you want some identification with people, you know, who are going to support you and this and that. And
it's just different. that move today is the liberal move. That wasn't what people in the past didn't have a choice about the hard road. The road was hard.
Right.
Yes.
Good
now,
point, yeah.
the road was hard. Now
Yes.
it's a choice. The hard road is now a choice. That's why Daniel emphasizes absolute choice. Now the hard road is a choice. And so
Yes.
I'm just saying that this identification with givens now is false because it's basically professional, liberal, middle-class people who don't know what to do with their emptiness.
Mhm.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And the issue is that in the past, belonging was not chosen. So in a sense, it wasn't even yours. Now it can be chosen, but that's precisely why it's so hard. And you don't even want it, really. You'd rather just go back to thoughtlessness.
That's why we're so fucking crazy because we don't have,
Yes.
you know, we don't have it laid out for us. And that's also the opportunity, right? It's both those
Exactly.
things. It's like,
Well,
it's
but
the potential for psychosis is so marked at the moment. It's like,
yes.
at the same time, the potential for creativity is marked too. And then, so why are people being so mediocre?
Well, this is where the shine of philosophy is important because it's almost like they don't know how not to be mediocre because they don't even have the idea or the encounter of the shine to show them the alternative. And that's why communities like this and transparency and some kind of marking that doesn't give in to the temptation of the fourth temptation is really important, right? But it operates not as a proselytization, but a beauty. Shining and bringing people forth, and the question is increasing that transparency. But the key is, like you were talking about Topolo's experiment. No, I am not claiming that there are not people. Here's the issue. You can, in a way, return to something like traditional belonging if you're radically isolationist. No technology, no encounter with the other, and it's almost like that movie, The Village. And this is the Amish strategy. There are people that do this.
Mm-hmm.
It can work for you in your radical particularization. But the issue is, if you are going to be involved with the internet or global pluralism or on a global stage, then I agree that it's fragile. It's only a matter of time before some sort of effort to return, like Cadell was getting at, these efforts to kind of return to a past state. It increasingly does not work on the individual level, except temporarily. It's only a matter of time before that fragility is broken, either because you encounter difference, you hear ideas you've never thought about, et cetera, et cetera. Your friends are worried about you because you're having ideas that they don't understand. It's only a matter of time before the pathological response. In order to actually make it work, it would require a radical level of isolationism, which I'm not saying is impossible, but it is certainly not going to deal with the problems of global geopolitical problems, the meta crisis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So critically, I think what's also being pointed at is, for me, it is incredibly unfortunate. I mentioned the temptations of Christ, that the temptations of Christ are not, in my opinion, understood correctly. What is Satan tempting Jesus with? To basically accomplish everything without going through the cross. I'll give you the world. I'll give you dominion over all this world. What is happening today is basically the temptations of Satan, in a way, for Jesus.
Without the emptiness.
Is without the emptiness.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we've done. In a way, modern Christianity has given in to the temptations of Satan, is what I'm saying, in this kind of negative way.
Yeah, it would appear so. And that's what Ivan Illich said, actually. He said, yes, the corruption of the best is the worst.
Yes,
that's correct. In other words, like the worst thing for a real Christian would be the form that Christianity is taken today as this mediocre defense of Western culture or givens.
Yeah, because basically Satan is tempting Jesus to obtain what the Father would have of him without going through the cross, without the encounter of negativity. So in a way, and this is very well written on, basically what Cadell was saying, that the opportunity to be a Christian comes after the collapse, the encounter of negativity. Yeah, that is 100% correct. There's no other way towards something like sainthood as a more valid category than merely being saved, than some sort of encounter with emptiness. So then the value, here's the funny thing. The value of attentionalism is precisely the emptiness, is precisely an increasing awareness of this negativity, of which then makes people receptive. It's not winning attentionalism. It's not winning marketing. It's the saturation of its possibility to where you can no longer plausibly deny that it isn't empty, of which then opens the subject to being attracted by the faithful presence communities. But it's a very inverse relationship than what people think. Likewise, the value of Christianity is having you die, not the south, like to actually go through the cross. To not do so is to give into a temptation of Satan, of Jesus in the wilderness, if you will. And it's a massive mistake, but please.
Well, I just wanted to sort of frame what we're talking about today in psychoanalytic language is that I think that, and this is in some sense derived from what Sweeney was saying, is that, the potential for psychosis today is so high. Also, the potential for creativity is so high. I think we need to understand the stakes of historicizing psychoanalysis properly, because in Freud's day, the problem was neurosis. In Freud's day, the problem was the overly strict father law that causes neurotic symptoms. But our day, there's no father law anymore. And we have the emergence of psychosis, perversion, and both perverts and psychotics are here in the language we've been using more on the side of the satanic temptation. Because perverts and psychotics, they obscure lack in a very specific way. The pervert will instrumentalize the other. The pervert will just use the other as a tool. Right? That's what the pervert does. He just uses the other person as a tool. He gets an enjoyment from the other as a tool. Then the psychotic, I think this is good language. The psychotic pretends they have the kingdom. Like the psychotic just thinks, I already have the kingdom. Like it's all full already. And as a consequence of that, perverts and psychotics don't know how to work. This is like, they don't know how to mediate anything because they don't actually have any touch with lack. They won't pick up their cross. Psychotics and perverts won't pick up their cross. This is why I think we need a return to neurosis. A return to neurosis is a return to the cross. A return to neurosis is the key to the drive, actually. And I think that where we went wrong, and I still do think, actually, like I've had a few Jungians at the portal, and I've actually was on a Jungian YouTube channel where I was doing a presentation on Freud and Jung. I think it's a false debate, the Freud-Jung debate, because Jung is, and I even in my portal session with Alyssa Polizzi, who's a Jungian, she even agreed with me that Jung is just not a psychoanalyst. Like Jung, there might be value in Jung, but he's not psychoanalytically. He abandoned psychoanalysis. He became more of a prophet, spiritual, religious figure. He didn't like, and today Jungians might have a lot of popularity in spiritual communities, but they're relatively little use value in the clinic. So like in terms of clinical work, it's still mostly Freudian. And I just want to say that because to me, Jung took the temptation of going against the father and into a psychotic fullness. Like he is the psychotic fullness. He is the going against the father, but we need to work with the negativity of neurosis is the point. And to work with the negativity of neurosis, I think, is the condition of possibility to actually be able to work with others who are also lacking. And I think that's what the stakes of whatever these communities are and the stakes of this work is, to actually be able to be the subject of drive that can work with others who are lacking. And I just want to give one example before stopping is, like we said, there are these Substack influencers that are in some sense ruining Substack. I listened to a podcast with one of them, and he was just he was brutally open that he was just using Substack for attentionless dynamics. He was just trying to design a Substack to manipulate as many people politically as possible. And he said explicitly, like, there's no possibility of real relations with the people who are following me. And I think the difference is at Philosophy Portal, no, like if you get involved, like there's the possibility for a real relationship there. Like we could actually meet, we could build things, we could create together. There's the possibility. It's not just a online platform that is just permanently keeping you at a distance or something like that. That there's the possibility for real relation. So I just want to say that this is the difference between attentionless dynamics and true socialist emancipatory work. Attentionalism is not the path to socialism. The path to socialism is a deep commitment to the work of negativity in which social life might be possible.
Well, I mean, to jump in, I mean, Philip Reith warned that in Jung, it was a return to private religions, and there was a concern that it would go off into the psychotic. What's interesting is there's a way in which you had to leave the neurotic, kind of go into the psychotic, but now there's a kind of return to the neurotic, but it's in a different caliber, a different quality, like the return to common life I talk about with Hume, the return that Hegel will stress, where it's a kind of returning to an authority, but you choose it. But this is the weird move of why I talk about the absolute choice. If you choose it, how can it have authority over you? Because you chose it. Don't you have authority over it? This is the weird move that is required for some sort of return to the neurotic that is not a regression. A return to the father that is not a regression, where you choose the father, and then better yet, the father chooses you. Like you mentioned before, Cadell, where the father is amazed by the children. Like rather than the children amazed like that. That, though, is only possible in the context of a relationship with the father, which you will only have if you choose the father, and then you are in the place where they can be amazed by you. This is the dynamic required today. I think it required Jung, in a way, required leaving common life, because otherwise you were stuck in the bad. But now you have to return to it. It's the return to common life, the return to these things, which is crazy, and it requires an absolute choice because you have to choose something to be absolute over you. Why would you do that? And how does that even work? Cadell, please.
I just want to say quickly, there's an asymmetry here, which is important, is that yes, we need a father that chooses the son, but the asymmetry is the father has to wait for the son to choose the father first. The father can't choose the son if the son doesn't choose the father first. And so that's the difficult move. The son has to choose the father, and then the father can choose the son, and that's the key to getting the jouissance correct today.
Are you seeing that in the relationship between Freud and Jung? Jung
I'm saying that as a metaphor. I'm saying that as a metaphor. I'm saying that as a metaphor for student-teacher relationships. I'm saying that as a metaphor for intergenerational dynamics. The son has to first choose the father, then the father can choose the son. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that in that situation, when in the situation with Jung and Freud, Jung did choose the father, but then he, I think, betrayed his own choice.
Or he was betrayed by his own father. You could look at it that way. It was an infanticide, but just because I'm probably more fond of Jung than you are, but I think there is a way in which Freud represents the father, and Jung went towards the maternal or the feminine, or you can see that in Hollywood. Like all the Hollywood writers and people like that are very into Jung, and all the storytellers and the people like that are into Jung because it's this fantastical world, and imaginal world. Whereas perhaps they're lacking this Freudian, firmness.
it's that there's a relationship between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real.
Mm-hmm.
And choosing the father is, the son is imaginary.
Yeah.
The son wants to be real.
Yeah.
But the son wants to be real, but in order to be real, he has to choose the symbolic that he's identifying with, and he has to be faithful to that choice. He has to follow through that choice, and then maybe he can be a real boy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, I think that's. I mean, it's very interesting with the relation between Freud and Jung, because the way Philip Rieff kind of put it, is that like Freud wanted to kind of free man to choose, and then Jung was like, but what will they choose? And so it's like, well, we can give kind of the imaginary, the private thing, but the issue is with that, you can just go off into the psychotic. Like what we're seeing today, and this is where Lacan kind of comes in, there's this kind of idea is that we need to be free to choose the negativity, free to choose the encounter of the negativity, which is what is moving into the place of the relation to the father, to where we choose the father versus the other way around, like Cadell was saying. But that requires, you're only going to get to that place going through a certain negativity and risking all of the rejections from, say, the people that you leave behind who identified with the neurotic without ever leaving the neurotic, right? And to me, it brings to mind this, so that to me is getting at a lot. In a way, I guess it's kind of like what we learn in Lacan is that the father is lacking, right? That the father is lacking. The father is lacking. That's right. Yeah. It is this kind of commitment to the lacking of which then chooses you because you chooses it and it has authority over you.
But this is why you can betray your choice of the father. You can choose the father on the basis that you think they're full, which would be a nightmare. But you betray the mediation of the father because you find out he's lacking as well. And so you think, well, why did I choose this father then? But I just want to say very quickly, because Zizek made this really good point in Christian atheism, that in the same way that we should see Christianity as unique, as a religion that you have to get, is a religion that's only possible after sublating Judaism. Like you have to go through Judaism to get to Christianity. In the same way, we should see this as the relationship between Freud and Jung. That Freud is the Jew and Lacan is the Christian. That, you know, like in some sense, Lacan is the Christian sublation of Freudian Judaism.
Well, and I should also note, like, and alas, I do have to go in about 10 or so minutes to take the children, but I've really enjoyed. This has been really wonderful. It's kind of like, in some respects, the prodigal son story, right? Like the son has to choose to come back, right? And then the father can run to the son, but the father can't run after the son. The son has to, like, F you, dad, leave, and then come back. But what is that? Encountering negativity, encountering the bad. There's a sense in which, you know, attentionalism or desiring, all of these things are valuable in so much as they bring you to the place where one day you're eating out of the pig, the slough with the pigs, and you go, this ain't going to cut it. And that sends you back, right? The value of desire in a way is to lead you to drive by emptying out. The value of marketing and all of the capital and all these things is to lead you to the place where you say, I need to go back because this sucks. And then the father can run out to you, right? And that's actually where we find belonging again. When the father runs to us because we choose to go to the father, not the father running after us. If the father runs after us, it leads to all sort of developmental problems, but also there's developmental problems if you're the prodigal son and you're under the father and you just pretend like it's okay and you never leave. That's the move. If the kid stays under the son, like, I hate being here, but I'm going to repress it. I'm going to pretend like it's okay. That's not good, because it's so interesting in that parable where the father says, have at it then. Bye. Lets him go. Lets the kid go. But then the kid has to go to get to the place where they encounter the emptiness and come back, and then the father can run to the kid. That dynamic is the dynamic in a way of belonging again, of actually coming to the place of belonging that then is shining. There's a shine in all of that. And I think, but then you have to be the kind of subject. So there's a subject that has the bravery to leave the father's house. There's a kind of bravery in that to say, Dad, I want to go. I want my inheritance to get out. There's a kind of bravery. There's a kind of courage in that, even if it's badly motivated, doesn't really matter. There's kind of a courage in it, but then there's also a humility or kind of castration in a good way where you say, I need to go back. So you need this kind of fullness, right? To kind of move to, but then the Father can come. And if it doesn't happen, well, let me put it this way. This problem, I think there is actually historical evidence of what occurs if you don't have a return to the Father in this way that we are describing. It's described by Tocqueville in Democracy in America. You could argue it's what happened under Mao in the Cultural Revolution. We could look at Mary Douglas. And what I mean by that is if you free everyone to be their own private religion, as Reef said, or to be their own individual subject without any honoring or any social, like symbolic that everyone observes to, then what happens on the American frontier under Tocqueville? Everyone goes like existentially crazy and nervous, and they go back to aristocratic designations and market designation because they can't handle encountering the other because they're not trained to handle lack. So they encounter the other. They have no philosophical training, because I think basically the role of philosophy today has a lot to do with training people to encounter the negativity and return to the common life. If they don't have that, then they regress to previous capital designations or market designations or things like that. Or, some interpretations of the Cultural Revolution under Mao, and the guy at One Dime was talking about this. I really liked his presentation, but there were a few books on this as well. Mao did literally, as a communist, leave communities to decide their own fate and to do whatever they wanted, right? They all ate themselves because the psychotic cannot relate with one another if they're not attuned to handling negativity. So you couldn't move into communism. So there are in my opinion, there are empirical case studies in history that show you what happens when you release people without any capacity of the subject to return to the Father, as I'm describing it. They eat themselves or they regret. They either eat themselves or they regress. So you must teach people now to handle this negativity, or it's just going to be auto-cannibalism or regression, both of which result in all sorts of pathology. So this schema that we're describing, and then I'll pass it on, I think is strongly backed by freaking history. That it's actually been seen and done, and we know what happens, and it leads to all sorts of problems.
Yeah. So the return to the Father is not necessarily return to cultural Christianity. It's a return to a mode. It's a return to an acceptance of where one comes from on some level. I think it's not a nostalgic return to a outmoded form of being, and also recognizing that what one is returning to is broken and weak and not some ultimate authority. But is also connected to the ultimate authority in that what or God or whatever, if you want to use that kind of language. That's how I'm thinking of it as you're speaking. This conversation, I think, is like, I feel like I want to keep going for a very long time, which means because there's so much here, but my brain skills are leaving me at this point. But I love talking to you guys, and I really want people to encourage people to come to Daniel's course. I think you'll get some of this, in a larger collective state, because basically this is what we do in your course, isn't it, Daniel?
Yes, it is. Well, I've enjoyed speaking. I would just there's a way in which you can only return to the Father once the Father is human. Like, that's kind of the idea. Like, once you return to the Father, like Javier was saying that his relation with his dad changed when you say, oh, wait, they're a human being, right? They're not this kind of big other, like it's just, oh, they're human, right? And this is critical, I think, they're fallible and they're finite. They're in it with you, right? And I think that's really important. And then I'll pass it on, is that in the story of the prodigal son, the father runs to the son and humiliates himself, lifts up his dress, he runs to them, he asks very unfatherly, he asks very overwhelmed by the attraction and sign of the child, the beauty of the child that would return, right? So he's not acting like a big other, if you will, or an authority figure. He's running out, right? And so there's a way in which the difference between staying in the Father which is the bad neurotic as we're describing. And this return to the Father is the return to the Father, which is the absolute choice, is the identification of the Father as human, as ultimately negative, as created by human beings, and yet all the same, you absolutely choose it. And I think that's central for us today.
Okay. Any final words, Cadell?
Sign up.
Sign up for his damn course, everybody.
Sign up to the course.